Justice Conference. This is day 2 of our conference, and I must say, if you missed day 1, please take some time to go watch it on Facebook. Our previous speakers tackled some important topics such as parent engagement, navigating the legal system, and dismantling the myth of polarization. Needless to say, I have high expectations of day 2. But before we get started, let's do some quick housekeeping. Please place yourself on mute throughout the presentation so we can hear clearly. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. If there's time, we'll try to address those questions after each presentation. Now, to start off day 2, please help me welcome our co-chair and the Education Outreach Coordinator, Stacy Waters, for some opening remarks. All yours, Stacy.
Thank you, and welcome to the final day of our second annual School to Prison Pipeline Conference. We will conclude our conference with our keynote address and 2 very other remarkable speakers. But first, I'd like to introduce you to the Commission's Executive Director. Executive Director Chad Dion Lassiter is a pioneer in social work, social justice, and a subject matter expert in race relations. He has lent his expertise on issues related to race, peace, and poverty, both in the US and abroad. Executive Director Lassiter earned a bachelor's degree in social work from Johnson C. Smith University in 1995 and earned his master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Social Work, where he was awarded the A. Philip Randolph Award in 2001. He is a co-founder and president of the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practices Black Men at Penn, and which is the first Black male, the first Ivy League Black male group of social workers. As executive director, he launched our No Hate in Our State town hall campaign to address the surge of white nationalism in the state of Pennsylvania. He has also developed programs such as the Global Social Justice Initiative, the Black and Jewish Beloved Community Dialogue, and the College Race Dialogue Initiative. Please welcome the recipient of the Pennsylvania Social Worker of the Year Award and PHRC's Executive Director, Chad Dion Lassiter.
Thank you so much, Stacy, for the graciousness and the presentation. And as you know, as multiple others know, at the end of the day, just a servant leader, just doing what I need to do in this journey called life. Really excited about day 2. We've received so much feedback from day 1. You really don't want to come into a space where you start mentioning names, because then people may say, well, I sent you an email as well. But I do want to publicly just acknowledge Ariane Bethea, who's been at the PHRC Philadelphia Regional Office for over 20 years. He sent me an email just this morning and also sent it to Stacy that just pulled at my emotional heartstrings, and several other folks as well. I just want to just once again, like day 1, acknowledge the co-chairs, Gerline L. Leroy, Stacy Waters. I want to thank Zulai yesterday for moderating. Excited about Gregory moderating today. Want to also just acknowledge what our Director of Communications has been doing to get us to this point from a tech standpoint, from a branding standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, and always good to see, you know, our dear colleague Ian. Prior to coming on, we were speaking briefly with Paige, and Paige told us, like, get ready, because she's getting ready to bring it. And so put your metaphoric seatbelts on, get ready for what she's going to bring. I'm always in a spirit of listening and in a spirit of learning. And so, you know, I'm really, really excited about our keynote, who's a dear colleague and friend of mine. And I'm also excited about Dr. Benjamin Williams. I want to end by simply saying, so Stacy, you read that bio, but in my household, if your name is not Mark Lamont Hill or Michael Cord, my mom don't care about anything that I do. And Michael Cord is someone that my mom really respects. And she said maybe a couple of months ago, before I die, I just want to meet him and talk to him. So I arranged a phone call between Michael Cord and my mom. So I'm still that young guy from North Philadelphia that no matter what I accomplished, You better show up to church on Sunday, you better take out the trash, and you better water mama's plants. And so happy to be here today. So very proud of this committee. We're already thinking about next year, this committee being in person. We have other members of PHRC who wants to join this committee, and we're building upon something. And we could not do it without the co-chairs and without all of you who make up this committee. So without further ado, restoration, redirecting the path towards positive educational outcomes. And I'm ready to put my seatbelt on and get ready. I got my pen and paper ready to listen, ready to learn. And once again, greetings and welcome to everyone.
Thank you, Director Lassiter, for setting the pace. Please help me welcome committee member Ian Fonstock, who will be introducing our first speaker for the day. It's all yours, Ian.
Thanks, Greg. Allow me to introduce our next guest speaker, Attorney Paige Jokey. She is a staff attorney at the Education Law Center, where she represents students, conducts trainings, advocates to address the individual and systemic educational barriers facing students in Pennsylvania, and is responsible for leading the Education Law Center's Philadelphia-based Black Girls Education Justice initiatives. Paige joined ELC's staff in 2017 as an Independence Foundation Public Interest Law Fellow with a focus on eliminating individual and systemic barriers to quality education for students experiencing homelessness in the Philadelphia region. Originally from Boise, Idaho, Paige completed her undergraduate studies with honors at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. In 2014, Paige was selected as an NAACP LDF Earl Ward Fellow and a Temple University Beasley School of Law Reuben Presser Social Justice Fellow. During her time at Temple Law, Paige participated in clinical internships through the Shelter Center for Social Justice and worked at the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. Paige interned and externed with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she was selected for the Honorable Lewis H. Pollock Memorial Scholarship. She also served as a student mentor for the Black Law Student Association and Reuben Presser Fellowship. Upon graduation in 2017, Paige was inducted into the Reuben Presser Public Interest Honor Society. She also received the Beth Cross Award for her notable contributions to public service at Temple and devotion to pursuing a legal career in social justice. Please welcome Attorney Paige Jokey.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's so wonderful to see you. I am going to try to share my screen, so if somebody could let me know if it works, and then we will get this show on the road. Are you able to see?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So first, thank you for the kind introduction. I wanted to share a little bit more about the Education Law Center and our broader work before chatting this morning about very important subjects around racial justice and injustice in our schools. Before I started, I just wanted to provide a brief trigger warning because not learning education around our histories and about our past can be a source of trauma, and it also can be traumatic to learn this information. So I invite you to take good care of yourselves while I'm speaking. If you need water, need a snack, have to go off camera, please know that that won't upset me any. I'm really excited to learn together with you today. So the Education Law Center is a nonprofit legal advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring access to quality public education for all children in Pennsylvania. And to effectuate our mission, we have 3 priority areas, including equal access to quality public schools, adequate and equitable school funding, which we'll talk more about in just a moment, and dismantling pathways to confinement, also known as the school to prison pipeline. So the key topics that I'll be discussing this afternoon are the enduring harms of educational deprivation, and I'll situate the markers of educational deprivation survived by Black people from American slavery into the present. We will see linkages and we'll talk about them as we embark on this presentation together. I will put historical conditions into context and provide a window into present day deprivations persisting both in Pennsylvania and here in Philadelphia. And I'll also put forth some recommendations for educational reparations that could make our schools more equitable and fully serve the communities that are benefiting from public education. And so in doing so, I'll propose policy and practice conditions that would be necessary to rectify entrenched centuries-old injustices. So before I start, I think it's just important to really unpack the impact of education and what it means. And so education deprivation, so when you think about somebody not getting what they need in an educational context, has lifelong and consequences for generations to come. So access to education and educational attainment, which means the level of educational privilege one has, impacts everything from literally how long people live to generational health and well-being, which looks like access to appropriate healthcare and mental health care, nutritious foods, earning power, access to living wages, access to community resources that are affirming and culturally responsive, and distance from poisonous environmental conditions. Also, access to permanent and adequate housing. Young people who don't have access to a diploma or an equivalent are 346% more likely to be experiencing homelessness than their peers who do have this level of educational privilege. And the last area I wanted to highlight is incarceration rates. So folks who have higher levels of education are less likely to come into contact with criminal justice and carceral systems. So education means a lot. And so when students aren't getting what they need, that impact pervades their lifetime. And if they choose to have families of their own one day, or caretake the livelihood of those individuals. So let us start with a bit of context about our history. So unfortunately, America has a history of hiding educational deprivations under the rug. Despite irrefutable evidence that they exist, they're massive, and that they occur and recur over generations. Education doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it's part of the community ecosystem itself. So when communities aren't being invested in, you're going to see that in their schools. So what happens in school comes in community, and what happens in community comes back into school. What is important here is that oftentimes educational deprivations are cast as normal, predictable, and unworthy of being challenged. So sometimes somebody will say a school name and somebody will say, oh yeah, I know a lot about that school, or those children go there, as if that's fine, that some people aren't getting access to what they need. And so just being mindful of our own language and the way that students not getting what they need and our communities not being fully served has been sort of understood to be all right. So I'm here to disrupt that for everybody today. There's also some depreciative language that's used to invalidate and blame the experiences of individuals subjected to education deprivation. So I see, and I represent students from preschool to age 21, and I hear a lot of things about the students aren't trying, they're not doing what they need to do, and a lot of really harsh language to discuss students and families, when the real issue is that we don't have the conditions necessary for young people to learn and thrive, and we can if we make change. So dismantling the current system is a challenge. It's something I plan to dedicate my life to and have a front row seat to do every day. But here are some of the reasons why it's hard to challenge our current state of education. The first is that the Constitution of the United States doesn't guarantee a right to education, which means that the ways that our system plays out are intentional. And our nation, as we all know, was built upon a bedrock of white supremacy, and education has not been able to avoid those principles or those impacts. Our system by design was intended to be anti-poor and anti-Black, and I'll get into the history of that in just one moment, but just hold that in your mind as we're going through this presentation. The legal tools we have are often ineffective against harms, and there are a few reasons for that. There are access to justice issues that preclude even filing a lawsuit or engaging with an attorney, even if there are actionable claims. And what that means is that even if it is possible to challenge a system, it can be impossible to get the legal representation that is necessary to do that. Victories can be narrowly tailored to only address a certain district or a certain circumstance, which means if you fix an issue one place, it could continue in another place. And the Supreme Court decisions have limited the ability to challenge discriminatory practices that have a disparate impact, like disciplinary exclusions and other types of deprivations, which we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. So to begin, educational deprivations are rooted in American slavery. So racism is the history of our country and slavery is at its origin. So the educational evils perpetrated against Black people in terms of education really do originate in slavery. And that's because the education of people who were enslaved was explicitly prohibited, because education itself was cast as a grave and specific threat to the institution of American slavery. What you can see is that there were actually state laws that were passed to effectuate this end beginning as early as 1740. And in spite of the horrific conditions of American slavery, some Black people covertly worked to educate themselves and educate each other, because Black people come from a vibrant and beautiful history of working to satisfy both intellectual curiosity and material needs. And if you're interested in the resources, they're all linked so you can learn more as well. I know I learned a lot putting together this presentation, and so I invite the learning not to end with our time together today. So next, we'll be talking about educational abuses and Jim Crow. So while the 13th Amendment formally ended American slavery in 1865, Black people who survived the formal institution of American slavery then created their own schools, which were really interesting because they had teachers that identified as both men and women, which was unusual for the time. And schoolhouses also served as centers for both education and community and cultural needs. If you look to our models of community schools, you can see some of the same things that Black people have always been linking academics with culture, with history, and with serving the community. And so this is an important fact that not many people know about our education system. So despite these spaces that were serving people to the best of their ability, Southern states quickly assembled taxes for public schools that were segregated and only served white children. And we'll see some direct correlations to this practice even in present day. So Black families were then charged with paying taxes and paying out of their own pockets to enhance schools that weren't able to serve their community. And as I mentioned, this phenomenon continues to present day. The 14th Amendment then comes into place in 1868, guaranteeing all citizens equal protection of the laws. And then there was a decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS, if you see the abbreviation in the PowerPoint, affirmed racial segregation in schools. I recently was able to see the marker of where Mr. Plessy was arrested, and I can tell you that it was a really transformative experience for me. There's now a beautiful civil rights monument in that place, but it's really important to remember that the decisions that supported inequity still are visible today. And this then ensured that Black children were placed in inferior educational environments. Also, Black schools and Black communities are burned down, and Black communities are terrorized as a result of this decision. And the federal government and state government acts as accomplices while this is happening, sometimes silently and other times more explicitly, which then brings us to Brown. And just as a disclaimer, these are not all of the important educational markers. There are just some that are necessary to lay the foundation for our discussion about what's happening in present. So in 1954, Brown was decided unanimously that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And this remains the Supreme Court's most important decision about the meaning of equity in our democracy. And it paves the way for integration in other facets of life as well. What is little known but very important about the decision is that it also strikes at the heart of some of the tenets of white supremacy, including the intellectual abilities of Black people to learn, the health and cleanliness of Black people. So prior to Brown, there were concerns that Black people didn't engage in the same health practices, and so students shouldn't be together. Mind everybody, this was happening when Black individuals were largely taking care of white children in other contexts, and that was seen to be fine, but not integration. So there's some specific language in Brown 1 that addresses those concerns. And it also strikes back at pernicious sexual stereotypes about Black men. And after Brown 1, there is something called massive resistance, which then comes into play to oppose integration, which then takes us to Brown 2 in 1955, in which it was decided that all schools must desegregate with all deliberate speed, and then the decision was punted to the federal courts to implement the order. Brown 2 actually leaves out two very important questions. The first being the when integration needs to occur, and the second is how it should proceed. So this gives the go-ahead then to districts across the country to intentionally frustrate the objectives of integration. And conspicuously, the word segregation isn't anywhere to be found in the decision, and also the original plaintiffs don't get relief. So then we move to the 60s to the 90s, and belatedly in 1968 and in 1969, the Supreme Court of the United States finally gives the directive that all deliberate speed means now is put aptly by Nikole Hannah-Jones in two court cases, Green versus County School Board of Kent and Alexander v. Holmes County Board of Education. Districts then race to have unitary status declared, which means that they're not segregated anymore, to get up from out of desegregation order. So what they would do is they would change their practices, get unitary status, and then go back to the same business of segregating without the watchful oversight of the court, which causes many schools to properly resegregate. And then in the 80s, we get the rise of the Reagan and Bush Justice Department and the Rehnquist Court, which are hostile to integration efforts. And by the 1990s, many desegregation orders are ended, but others continue for decades. So where does that leave us as a country? Not positively. Schools are even more segregated now than they were in the times of Brown, and that's because segregation left to itself tends to mutate and persist in lots of different ways. And so the trends show us that Black students are bearing the brunt of the most segregated schools, which are commonly also some of the most under-resourced schools. And the federal government regrettably has positioned itself in silent complicity. There has been de minimis investment in voluntary integration programs. Decades have come and gone without any meaningful research or investment into integration. And facially neutral language around school choice and local control has buttressed in practices of segregation along the lines of race, eligibility for special education supports, and economic privilege and socioeconomic stats. So let's get local. What's going on in Pennsylvania? So we have a constitution, the state constitution, that requires the General Assembly to provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. There's the legal site for any of y'all that are curious about what our Constitution says. Unfortunately, we rank the 7th least in state investment in education. And by the school code's own adequacy measure, we fall short by about $4.6 billion, and that's billion with a B. That is an incredible amount of money that we need, but we don't have. And so that results in the average adequacy gap for students in the so-called lowest wealth districts to be about $4,800 per student, which is a lot of money when you think about the investment in young people and the resources that they need to learn and thrive at school. We also have a system that is highly unusual. Local property taxes are the largest source of funding. They make up about 53% of our local funding, followed by 34% of state funding and 13% of our school funding coming from the federal government, which in Pennsylvania means that communities of color repeatedly tax themselves more than white districts with higher property values, and yet they can still not raise comparable funds. So when you think about systems of inequity and people paying more for systems of education that are not serving them well, you can look no other place than our own state, and this is happening in other places around the country also. Pennsylvania is also home to some of the most racially segregated schools in the country, and we have the most economically segregated schools in the country. If you're interested on what can be done about this, please check out our ongoing fair funding litigation. Here's the link. You can check it out at fundourschoolspa.org. The case is William Penn. Currently, the Education Law Center, the Public Interest Law Center, and O'Melveny are suing the state for failing to fund education and provide for a thorough and efficient system of public education. If you happen to want to learn more and engage in the case, we have the next set of oral arguments on July 26th, which will deal with important legal issues raised in the case. So now I want to turn to the outcomes that are caused by fair funding. So Black students are bearing the brunt in our inequitable fair funding scheme. For anybody who's visual like me, I have a fancy chart to show this. So state aid to school districts should correlate with the percentage of students receiving free and reduced lunch, which is a measure of poverty. So if things were to be equitable, all of the districts would line up on this fancy Black diagonal line. However, what you see instead is that low wealth white school districts receive more funding than similarly situated Black and brown school districts. So the dots that are blue are represented by hyper-segregated white schools, and the dots that are red are represented by hyper-segregated Black and brown school districts. And so what you actually see is that students who attend white schools that have the same level of funding as schools that predominantly serve students of color, the students of color are getting less money. And that's at a rate of about $2,000 per student. So those inequities are really striking and to me are really disturbing. This is not a picture of equity, it is a picture of harm. And these harms are very visible in our schools today. Black children are subjected to poisonous educational conditions. What you see in this image, and I just want to pause for folks to take a look at this if you're able, this is mold in a classroom where kindergartners are supposed to be learning. It is toxic to their health. Young people and staff and professionals and teachers and principals and administrators are being forced to be in environments that are literally toxic to their well-being. In Pennsylvania, we have schools that are riddled with lead, asbestos, and mold, that have infestations of vermin and other environmental hazards, and where students are denied the very, very basics due to the accident of geography of where they live and how much the schools in their community have because of our inequitable funding system. And sometimes when folks are asking like, well, what are the basics? I'm going to tell you, these things should be essentials in school, and yet our students don't have them. There are not enough desks to ensure that every student has a place to learn. There are not current textbooks. There are not adequate specialized personnel and staffing. So that means your school may not have somebody who can be a librarian, who can be a school nurse, who can provide needed behavioral health interventions. You might not have access to a school counselor. Your schools could have unsafe temperatures. Right here in Philadelphia, you might notice that in the winter and in the summer, sometimes schools have to physically close for a few days because the temperatures are unsafe. They are too hot to be safe and they are too cold to be safe. We also have many schools that have inadequate bathroom access. If you tuned into the school funding litigation, you would have heard terrifying and horrifying testimony that in some schools, the ratio of bathroom access is 1 toilet to 75. Just going to pause there. 75 kindergartners. These conditions are unconscionable. And in addition to the physical buildings causing harm to our students, many students are being educated in physical spaces that are also toxic for other reasons. We have codes of conduct and student handbooks, which all schools have, and they specify what rules students need to follow or they could face discipline. However, the rules that students are expected to adhere to are often racialized and subjective. And so I'm going to give some examples now. Black students are punished for showing up to school for who they are. We'll get to some dress code examples in a few minutes, but the way I show up to you all in this presentation, I could actually be suspended and removed from school for having my hair in braids that are multiple colors. You can't see, but they are, for wearing jewelry, for wearing lashes, for having my nails done. All of the things that I do to express my own expression and myself could result in discipline, and it does for many students who attend our schools. Our codes of conduct also invite bias like racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, and transphobia, which underpin subjective decisions about who is punished and the severity of the consequence imposed. And punishments stem from or can range from excluding a young person from a learning environment to suspending them, telling them they can't come to school for under 10 school days, or expelling them, which is an exclusion lasting more than 10 consecutive school days or a pattern in some other cases. Young people are pushed out since preschool. This happens to babies. So just as a disclaimer, there is absolutely no evidence at all, it doesn't exist, that Black and brown young people are more likely to break school rules than white children. Doesn't exist. But what evidence does show us is that for the same behaviors, Black and brown students are likely to be punished and white students aren't. And when they are punished, it's likely to be that Black and brown students are punished more harshly for identical behavior. So Black students were deprived 5 times the number of school days to white students in the country due to the rampant use of suspensions. Black girls are 7.3 times more likely to be suspended more than once compared to white girls. And 47% of Black preschoolers have been suspended from a preschool program. So they are suspended before they even are, when they're babies, and before they're in systems of K-12 education. This is really horrifying. And we know that these numbers are an undercount because despite being required to report this data, oftentimes schools are not fulfilling that obligation, or they're using practices to skirt necessary reporting practices, such as using constructive suspensions that aren't documented. Some things I see a lot in my practice are calling the parent and saying you need to come get your child, threatening to call DHS if they don't come get their child, threatening to have children subject to involuntary psychiatric commitment, known as a 302, if they don't pick up their child. For older young people, telling them that they're just going to have a half day, releasing them from school, or placing them in other settings that are not the classroom as a punishment. So a question on folks' minds might be, do suspensions work? The answer is no. And they actually cause grievous generational harm. So a single suspension, so one day, one time, can decrease the likelihood that a student graduates high school at all. Suspensions fail to improve the outcomes of students who remain in class, so the students who are not suspended, in terms of test scores or graduation rates. And according to a study done in 2008 by the Government Accountability Office, suspensions increase the likelihood that students are pushed out altogether, forced to repeat a grade, or become involved with the juvenile justice system. So, as promised, here are some examples of schools in our area that have codes of conduct that could be implemented in a discriminatory way, because schools use racialized and subjective language to define behaviors that would allow a decision maker to punish or exclude students from school. And so students are disciplined for a vast variety of behaviors. And in fact, some of you may be engaging in some of the behaviors right at this very moment that could result, if you were a student, in being excluded from the educational environment, such as, and not to say any of you are doing this, you'll see what I mean in just a second, but things like disrespectful tone and body language, talking back, refusing to cooperate, being rude, silently mouthing words, or slouching in one's chair, which is the thing I was getting at just a minute ago. These are actual things that could result in punishment in our schools. These are real, these are in codes of conduct, and these are the messages that are being sent out. And this is a problem. Students should not be in spaces that they are surveilled and policed, and schools feel like prison environments because they can mirror them in terms of what types of behaviors could open up a student to punishment. Also, sucking teeth counts too. There are also discriminatory grooming codes, so rules that specify how students need to groom their bodies to come to school. I have 2 columns here, and I'm just going to put them up for you. So hairstyles that aren't neat, if they're innovative or flamboyant, if they're not well groomed, if they're colored or highlighted in any flamboyant colors. Red is included in that list if you were to look at it, which I'd count for this. No excessive parts. And there are lots of schools that ban culturally expressive hairstyles like combs or headscarves, wave caps, do-rags, Timberlands, hooped earrings larger than the size of a quarter, or so-called excessive jewelry. And my point in sharing these all to you is because they open up a lot of discretion about who can be punished and who can't. And they also use specific explicit language to target Black students and Black communities. Obviously, there's not one Black identity. We don't all express it the same way, but some of the things that schools are targeting are associated with some ways that Black people choose to express themselves through the things they put on and around their bodies. And so these rules send the very clear and unmistakable message that students are unwanted and unwelcome at school. And it doesn't just end with students. There are harmful and subjective practices that harm families. So for example, in our schools and actually across the country, caregivers can be banned from schools without a prior appointment for vaguely defined behavior. So here's an excerpt from the School District of Philadelphia's Code of Conduct, that they can ban students or ban parents for a specified amount of time without an appointment as a result of threatening and unsafe behavior, not otherwise defined. We have seen these notices at Education Law Center weaponized particularly against Black mothers who are advocating for their children and opposing discriminatory conditions in schools. So the school fails to respond to sexual harassment or discrimination, and the parents are actually banned as a result of advocating for children. Schools also rely on law enforcement like police to address vaguely defined caregiver behavior. So for example, a code of conduct states that if they pose a danger or threat, they'll be reported to the police. And this is what is in the code of conduct. This is what families get when they enter the door. And so if law enforcement are part of the conversation before day one, it can be very difficult for families to build meaningful relationships with students and, with schools. And also it sends the message that law enforcement are going to be part of students' everyday experience. So we know with over policing and the harms and the very public killing of Black people by police, that interaction with law enforcement can be traumatic for many people, and inviting them into educational spaces can cause grave harm. And in practice, we've seen police being called for things like somebody's voice being raised. Also, schools in Pennsylvania fine caregivers for picking up students. Alliance for Progress does this for late pickup after 5 minutes after school ends. They fine families $1 per minute for lateness. And just for context, Alliance for Progress serves 95% Black students, 84% of whom are living in poverty, and yet they're fining families. And there's the excerpt from their code of conduct. And if these things are shocking, they should be, because these are not the types of conditions that make learning conducive. And also, if you don't pay the fine, your child will not be able to participate in any school program, and they'll also hold report cards until all the balances have been paid in full. Emphasis is theirs. So these conditions are terrible and can be remedied. And so just collective deep breath. We've learned a lot of terrible things. How do we fix it? What can we do? What is the role that each of us can play? I'm going to now turn to some ways that we can challenge inequitable systems. So we can envision a better future. However, we need remedies. How are we going to do that? Well, we should amend the federal constitution to provide for a right to education. And this is important, to have a right that would affirmatively prescribe adequate, equitable, and culturally competent education free of segregation. This is important because education needs to be enumerated as a right in and of itself in our federal constitution. And it would also eliminate the patchwork of how different states conceive of what is required through individual state constitutions, which is how the right is currently recognized. It would make things more equitable and also ensure young people have what they need to learn and thrive. We should also have more effective legal tools to address educational deprivations. So disparate impact should be extended to the education context, which would allow a plaintiff or the person bringing the case to have a cognizable claim, a claim that could go forward based on evidence of disparate impact. So the practice or policy is causing harm disproportionately to a group without needing to prove that discrimination was the intention of that policy. We also need a clear private right of action to civil rights laws in our country. There are many laws that provide really robust protections, but if schools violate them, you can't actually sue them over it, which guts the ability for young people to get the protections that the laws are trying to provide. So this would allow people to sue over violations to address provisions that can currently be violated without consequence. And we should also require disaggregated, so by group, and intersectional data, so looking at people's multiple identities at one time, to actually trigger consequences for failure to address discriminatory practices. Because currently the way we collect data allows the facts to be obscured and inequities to be magically disappeared by the way we look at things. And it also frustrates targeted and effective remedies. So the good news is methodologies exist in other contexts, like in the special education context, where they look at disproportionate identification of Black students as students with certain types of disabilities. So we have models that work in other contexts that we could apply more broadly to how we collect information. And we also need school culture to change. Schools should absolutely affirm and celebrate students. I have sort of 3 buckets of things schools can do. If you look at the PowerPoint afterwards, I've hyperlinked some of the resources that Education Law Center has put forth. I'm really excited this summer we'll be releasing a new publication where we conducted focus groups with local groups that are experts in serving young people that speak to what Black girls say they need in our schools right now. And we're excited to help put their recommendations into practice. So here are things that schools can adopt and implement. Culturally affirming an anti-racist curriculum, restorative justice practices that have their roots in some indigenous cultures and are really important to ensuring that systems as a whole are responding to harm in the community and are not using punitive disciplinary interventions. We should adopt uniform and grooming policies that explicitly allow young people to express their culture and gender and prohibit discrimination on body shape, size, or appearance. Schools should provide culturally affirming mental health supports that specifically address manifestations of racism, sexism, and ableism in our school and police-free environments. And we also must root out the use of exclusionary discipline as acceptable interventions to often age-appropriate student misbehaviors, and root out subjective school rules that allow decision makers and their biases to creep into the ways decisions are made about who can stay in the classroom learning where they have every right to be, or who is forced to miss out on those life-changing opportunities. We need schools that are built upon a foundation of equity. Schools need to adopt affirming policies, and education and equity needs to be the very foundation. And school community members, so the people who are in schools, the families, the folks that live around schools, needs to be brought into conversation about what equity actually looks and feels like. One way schools can do this is through equity audits, where they actually ask, like, what do you need for our school to be equitable? What's working, what isn't? And this is an equity continuum by the Pennsylvania School Board Association, which spells out that equity needs to be the basis of everything, from who's on the school board to the administration, all the way up to what's served for lunch. And so if you look at equity being the foundation that is going to best serve students, they have some great resources. If you're interested in other recommendations we at the Education Law Center are making, you can check out our Promising Practices resource that is free and on our website. And so lastly, we must envision beyond the now. Black children deserve celebratory education spaces where they can learn, grow, and thrive. This is a piece of civil rights artwork I personally love from Jacob Lawrence's Migration series. This panel is talking about the importance of Black children being in schools that are adequately funded and where they can learn. I have a print of this actually in my office, and whenever I'm feeling discouraged, I always remember that we can envision beyond the now, and we have the tools within us to ensure that we are creating education spaces where our students have every opportunity to learn and thrive, which are the spaces that our children deserve. I thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to now stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Attorney Jokey. I think we have some time for some questions. There is one in the chat. This is from Chris Young. It says, is there an estimate on how much it would cost PA or nationally to at least get rid of the poisonous situations like lead? If there's any number comparing to how much we have recently shipped for war, will be telling. So I think he's trying to ask, basically, what would be the cost of trying to rectify the situation of schools that are underprivileged and underkept?
Yeah, I think can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, there was some feedback on my end. So I would definitely check out our website, Fund Our Schools. It has some really important information about how we could adequately fund our schools and what those numbers should look like. Also, there is a wonderful publication called Learn at Your Own Risk, which talks more specifically about what amount of money would be necessary to rectify the conditions in our schools. Unfortunately, I don't have a handy number that I can just give you, but I will tell you that many of the schools that our children are learning in across the nation and across the Commonwealth have hazards that haven't been yet identified. I too would be very interested in those numbers because I think it's telling where we as a society place our investments, and it should be in our children.
Absolutely. And I have a question. I used to work in systems with children, mainly detention. And so one of the bedrocks that we use to really look over these programs are regulations. And so when I see things like the pictures that you showed, where there's black mold, and my first thought was, there's no way that this should pass inspection in any form or fashion. And so as much as I like to look at the school itself, I have to look at the entity overseeing the school. And so I want to know if there's any way that we could address maybe actually the state of Pennsylvania and their board and their commission that is actually looking over schools and investigating schools and doing inspections of schools. How do we really address that?
Yeah, that is tough. And education is something that intersects lots of other health and safety concerns. If you are thinking about if there are conditions, like if you're a caretaker, for example, and there are conditions in your children's school, you can report those conditions using local hotlines, and then they can go in to examine the hazards. I will say mold is something you can see, but like lead and asbestos isn't something you can necessarily see. So it's hard to be able to calculate exactly the depth and also the types of hazards. So definitely be mindful if your children are reporting there are poisonous conditions in schools, that should definitely be addressed. And there are ways you can let the city know, let the state know. I can see in the chat, thank you to Deborah Gordon-Clare, who's the wonderful executive director of the Education Law Center, that there was a facilities report that found a $4.5 billion with a B price tag to make facilities in the district safe. So if you are concerned, those pictures are horrifying. There are also apps that you can download to actually take pictures of noxious conditions in schools, and then they go to the school where they are and hopefully are remedied from that point.
Thank you so much. Is there any more questions at this time? Feel free to come on and just give a question if you have one.
Gregory, this is Stacy. I don't have a question, but I have a comment. And I just thought it was great that Chris Young, our colleague, had asked about what the cost is to, provide these things, these resources that are much needed. I just want to make note, just add commentary that the cost is greater to not do it. I think sometimes we think we're being resourceful, we're efficient because we're cutting costs, but I think sometimes money's well spent when you spend it on youth, as Attorney Jokey had mentioned. The disparity is just horrifying.
Absolutely, I fully agree. Not addressing the issue is not actually helping the problem. But I also kind of wanted to touch back to something that you said, where Black children are punished for showing up to school for who they are. I think that's also important to talk about. Can you expound on that just a little bit further before we let you go? Oh,
It'd be my pleasure. Unfortunately, as evidenced by some of the dress codes that I shared, and these are just the sampling things I've come across in my work, but there are school rules and there aren't federal protections around culturally expressive hair. That's why employers can fire people in some places where they haven't passed affirming policies. But students can be sent home for looking like I present to you today. That's not right. And the ways that those codes are employed is that they are written in such a way that the ways that Black and Brown children and families and communities express themselves are considered to be afoul of school rules, but ways that other student groups present themselves are seen to be just fine. And that is a problem. So if you actually look at the code of conduct. And if any of you are caregiving, I recommend you do this and you see what rules the children that are in your life are subjected to. And I find school board meetings are a great place to call these things out, because sometimes the school hasn't taken a look at these in quite a while, and they might be open to, as I like to say, eliminating manifestations of white supremacy in their school or removing antiquated language that hurts students. And so in terms of your specific question, it's that schools ban ways that people express themselves that are narrow and specific to apply to Black and brown young people, which is a problem. Like some schools don't allow fades, they don't allow curly tops, they don't. And if you're a person who pays attention a lot in the news, there are tons of horrifying examples where young Black children are having their hair cut or forced to remove a piece of them that's part of their identity. And these aren't experiences that should be happening anywhere, but certainly not in the places where students have a legal right to attend and learn. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. So there is more questions for you. Gerline, you have your hand up. You want to come on and ask your question?
Absolutely. Attorney Njoki, such a great treat to see you again. I'm so glad you just wowed us with this presentation. I have a question about the effect of suspensions. You mentioned the negative impact that a suspension can have on a student's educational attainment. First of all, is there a difference in terms of impact of whether the suspension is in school suspension or out of school suspension? Also based on the length, and ultimately, what, if anything, can a parent do if their student is facing suspension, whether in or out of school?
Thank you for your question. And thank you again for making this presentation possible for me. I admire you and your work, so it's wonderful to see you today. I think the first thing families and caregivers and parents can do if a student is facing suspension, go to our website and look at our Know Your Rights guide, because it outlines when suspensions can happen and what schools need to do to follow due process, which are the steps they need to take in response to a suspension, and challenge it. It's really important that the suspension gets challenged the very first time, because what I see a lot in my work, it's a pattern of behavior. So rather than meeting a young person with supports, the first instinct is like, out of my classroom. And I am the daughter of 2 educators. I understand that schools don't have adequate funding and it can be difficult for teachers to respond to an array of student behavior. Also, teachers are not the only professionals that are necessary to help students learn. But the very first time a suspension happens, it's important that it be challenged. Also look at the language of suspensions. You will be shocked, or maybe not based on this presentation, but a lot of the language that schools use to define student behavior are words that are in the adult criminal system, like assault, mutual assault, assault and battery, reckless endangerment. And so challenge that. For young people, if they're in school, also make sure that they're aware of what their rights are, that they have an open dialogue with an adult so they can challenge the suspension. And also don't accept what a school gives you, even if it's on a formal fancy notice, as being right or compliant with the law. It's really important that you look at your rights and see if the paperwork that they have given you is actually legally sufficient. So you should, if there is a suspension, you should be notified in writing immediately. There should be an opportunity for the student to tell their side of the story before the suspension is imposed, except in limited health and safety circumstances. And if the suspension lasts enough school days, there's also a right to informal hearing. To your question about suspensions, the data I was referencing deals with out of school suspensions, but in school suspensions are really harmful as well, because they remove the student from the environment where they're supposed to be learning. And any absence from school, as anybody knows, like if you miss a day of work, like you come back, there's like tons of stuff piled up. That's what young people are experiencing too. And so it doesn't matter how the exclusion happens. There's no nice way to do it. There's no right way to do it. And there's no way to do it that doesn't hurt our kids.
Okay, thank you so much.
Absolutely. So we have 5 more minutes. So I'm going to take 2 more questions. Darlene, your hand was raised. You want to go next?
Thank you so much. Hi, Paige. Thank you for that great presentation. You mentioned
several times in your presentation the intersection between Black and Brown students and students with disabilities, and that there is a disproportionate effect where students who are Black and Brown are put in special education. And so I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more. Because I often find that people don't look at this intersection maybe as much as it needs to be.
Thank you for your question, Darlene, and it's wonderful to see you this morning. This is really important. So I think what Darlene is picking up on is that young people don't live single identity lives, like anybody doesn't live a single identity life. And so when you're looking at discipline, in particular, access to resources, it's really important to also look at students who are eligible for special education services and the intersection with race. So what you'll find is oftentimes young people who are students who are people with disabilities and also Black and Brown students are being suspended at even higher rates. They're not getting the supports and services that are necessary. So rather than looking at, is there a learning need that's unmet? Is there a behavior need that's unmet? Is there another type of need that's unmet? The student is just sort of labeled as a problem student and a student who it's just fine to discipline and exclude from educational environments. Something that I mentioned in my PowerPoint is that there is an overrepresentation of Black children among folks that have been recognized as having emotional disabilities, and there's drastic undercounts in other areas where we know that Black children may have needs, such as young people who have specific learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities. And so we can't just look at race, and we can't just look at whether or not a student is eligible for special education services, because it sort of erases the experience of the young people that live at that corner of that intersection. I hope, Darlene, that answers your question. I see that Education Law Center's Back to School Guide was put in the chat, and that has a much more fulsome, in-depth explanation of why looking at the intersection of race and special education eligibility is important.
I have a question.
Thank you. At this time, we're not able to take any more questions. Thank you so much, Attorney Jokey. Whenever you said that we need to put our seatbelts on, you weren't joking. I really appreciate your presentation. There was a wealth of wisdom that was impacted in your presentation. So we thank you once again for joining us.
My pleasure. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too, you too. Up next, we want to introduce committee member Gloria Richardson, who will be introducing our keynote speaker for today.
Thank you so much, Gregory. I want to introduce to you Attorney Michael Cord. Michael Cord is a criminal defense attorney with more than 25 years of state and federal trial experience. He specialized in murder cases and worked at the Charles W. Bowser Law Center after serving as a legal counsel for State Senator Hardy Williams. He received his degree in law from Ohio State University and his undergrad degree in English education and political science from Cheyney University. He is an adjunct professor in the African American Studies Department at Temple University and a volunteer instructor at the Criminal Justice course and the Hip Hop 101 course in the university's Pan-African Studies program. As a community activist, he is a founding member of the Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, ATAC. ATAC is the organization that helped lead the historic and successful battle to force the federal government to agree to commemorate the African descendants enslaved by President George Washington at America's first White House, which was in Philadelphia. As a member of the Friends of Bethel Burying Ground, he is working with activists to have that South Philadelphia cemetery, where the remains of more than 5,000 African Americans from the 1800s are desecrated under a trash dump and city playground, and have it officially memorialized. He has served as a Pennsylvania board member of the ACLU and the Philadelphia chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, as well as a member of the Occupy Philadelphia Legal Defense Team and the Pennsylvania Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Please welcome for us today, Attorney Michael Core.
Well, let me start by saying I heard that introduction. I was wondering who that guy is because he sounds quite impressive. And I then saw the image and I'm like, I didn't know that Idris Elba or Denzel Washington was going to be speaking, but I guess we all look the same, so it's good. Let me start out by thanking Executive Director Chad Dion Lassiter and the entire staff, especially the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission's School to Prison Pipeline and Restorative Education Committee. I'm absolutely honored to be here. And my topic is an interesting topic. It's a combination of what your focus is, along with some historical context. So my topic is from the 13th Amendment to convict leasing pipeline to school to prison pipeline. Let me repeat that. From the 13th Amendment to convict leasing pipeline to school to prison pipeline. And I understand that I have, 6 or 7 hours to do my presentation, so I will cover it all, or 50 minutes, 55 minutes, either way, I'll be happy to get it done. And often people accuse me of speaking too fast. I accuse them of listening too slow. So if you speed up your listening, we'll be on the very same page. And this is a professional presentation with professional people. So I always have to restrain myself because I don't know, depending on the topic, if I want to give my G-rated presentation or X-rated presentation. And I say that with all seriousness because I host a radio show, I write a weekly newspaper column, and I describe myself as the angriest Black man in America. But I don't mean angry in a destructive way. I mean angry in the way that James Baldwin meant when he said, and I'm paraphrasing, to be Black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. And that's just so true. It's no way that you can be Black and aware of American history and American present and not be angry. It just doesn't make any sense, but that anger has to be productive. That anger has to be constructive. You can't talk about engaging in violence and blowing up stuff because that's counterproductive. So my anger is the type of anger that James Baldwin talked about. And getting back to whether or not I'm going to use the G-rated version or the X-rated version, I'm going to be professional. So in cases where I would normally use profanity, and by the way, I'm a criminal defense attorney. And you know, wherever you are on the planet, you have to speak that language. You're in China, you got to speak Chinese. You're in France, you got to speak French. When you talk to the predominantly young Black men that I represent, you have to speak in the language. Otherwise, they don't understand you. I learned as an English major at Cheyney University that you're not intelligent based on the big words you know. You're intelligent based on how effectively you communicate with your audience. So you speak proper English in the boardroom and you speak street language on the street. So having said that, I'm not going to use the harsh profanity, but I will let you know what I'm talking about. And I'm not going to go into the stats about the school to prison pipeline because I know you had experts that, in fact, to the extent that I do have stats, I probably got it from some of the folks that you've already had on. So I don't need to repeat what they said, but I want to start out in terms of the school to prison pipeline. Then I'm going to go back to the history of this country from the 13th Amendment to convict leasing pipeline to school to prison pipeline. But I want to read something that I posted about a month ago on social media. I'm a criminal defense attorney who specializes in capital murder cases. Over the last 10 or 15 years, if someone has been accused of killing a police officer and faced the death penalty, I was appointed to represent that person. I'm not really a court-appointed attorney, but I handle only one type of court-appointed cases, and that's death penalty cases, because for me, the death penalty is always wrong under any circumstance. And I'm just speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, so whatever I say that might seem provocative or controversial, it's not on behalf of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, it's just on me. You know, when I say that death penalty is wrong under every circumstance, it certainly is, because when I debate people about it, I say give me your best argument for the death penalty. Give me your best argument. And they often have two. And one is that, well, Mike, what would you do if somebody brutally murdered your mother and father and they tortured them and they did X, Y, and Z? Wouldn't you want that person to be executed? Wouldn't you want to be on the jury to do the right thing? I'm like, well, the whole point of a jury is to be objective and to be rational. So if my mother or father were brutally tortured and murdered, then I couldn't be on the jury because I'd be as angry as you are. So that argument doesn't work. And the next argument is the eye for an eye. And I say, okay, so if we take that argument to its logical conclusion, then why don't we rob robbers? Why don't we kidnap kidnappers? Even better, why don't we rape rapists? I say we hire a state executioner to kill people. Why don't we hire a state rapist to rape rapists? And the person will pause and say, I guess that makes sense. I know it makes sense. So my point is, I'm just going to the fact that that's why I do what I do in terms of handling capital punishment cases, whether it's police officers who are killed or the little old lady down the block. It doesn't matter. The state should not be in the business of killing people. I say all that to say that I focus primarily on adult murder cases. But every now and then, if a friend of a friend contacts me, I'll handle a juvenile case. And I happened to be in juvenile court about maybe a month or so ago. And while I was sitting there, let me just read the short post that I put on social media. Here's what it says. I've been a criminal defense attorney for over 25 years. Although I specialize in adult murder cases, I do handle a few juvenile cases from time to time. And I'm going to tone it down. I'm not going to read you the profanity that I wrote. And the stuff is still messed up. I'm sitting in juvenile court right now, and every boy and girl is Black or brown. By the way, the entire court staff is white. And that's not only from me sitting in court about a month ago, it's when I used to do a whole lot of juvenile work 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. And I go on to write the following. And while I'm sitting here waiting for my client's case to be called, another youngster is pleading with the judge. And that youngster's lawyer is not present, but he wanted to address the judge. And I was about to go up there and tell him to shut the hell up because he might say something to incriminate himself, but I wasn't his lawyer. And then when I heard him speak, I wanted to give him a bullhorn because here's what happened. And while I'm sitting here waiting for my client's case to be called, another youngster is pleading with the judge. He is articulately and passionately and emotionally, incredibly explaining that the system is setting him up for failure, that it's messing with his head, and that nobody is listening to him. And I write here, he's correct on all 3 points. And I'm crying uncontrollably right now for him and for the tens of thousands of Black and brown boys and girls caught up in the system's pipeline. Black and brown adults are traitors for allowing this. And we are traitors for allowing this. This should not happen. It shouldn't have happened last month when I was in court. It shouldn't have happened 20, 25 years ago when I was a rookie lawyer and handled juvenile cases. So something is wrong with that. And it's really interesting because that kid, 14, 15 years old, that was really making an eloquent argument, I thought about myself. I was born and raised in North Philly at 20th and York to a single mother. And I went to the neighborhood school, Pratt Arnold, at 22nd and Susquehanna. And it was under-resourced like every other poor Black school in America. And in the 3rd grade, I got lucky and I did pretty good on a citywide test. So check this out in terms of school to prison pipeline and educational racism. What does the system do when little Michael Cord does well in the 3rd grade in the citywide test? They take me out of that North Philly Pratt Arnold school and they put me in Masterman. And many people are excited about that, but I'm like, that's BS. And the reason why that's BS is this. Instead of taking this one Black kid out of that North Philly school and putting him in Masterman, why the hell don't you provide the same resources to Pratt Arnold that you provide to Masterman? That kid who was going off like a lawyer last month, that kid could be a lawyer 10 years from now, 20 years from now. If they take him out of the system and they put him in a Masterman, then he'll be a Michael Cord or a Johnny Cochran. Michael Kors better, but you get my point. He could be that because he was just so thorough. And he wasn't, you could tell he wasn't book smart, but he was logical and he was rational. And it just goes back to how the system works with the whole educational thing. Again, I'm looking at little Tyrone who sat behind me at Pratt Arnold. Where is he now? I'm looking for Lakeisha who sat beside me at Pratt Arnold. Where is she now? Well, if they're anything like the guys and girls I grew up with in North Philly, they're either in jail or on drugs or underemployed. Why? Is there something wrong with them? No, I was no smarter than them. I don't know how they didn't get that good grade in that citywide test and wind up in Masterman, but they should have. And speaking of Masterman, it's really interesting because we had some kids there at Masterman who had some mental health or disciplinary problems. And I remember one kid, and this kid, white kid, he actually, from a wealthy family, I'll never forget this. He actually had a limousine to pick him up every Tuesday to take him to a psychiatrist. Think about that. A white kid at Masterman had a limousine to pick him up every Tuesday, I don't know, around 1 or 2 o'clock, and take him to a psychiatrist. And, you know, we weren't supposed to know where he was going, and I don't know why he had a limo to take him, but whatever the case, my point is, whatever mental health issues that kid had, whatever disciplinary problems that kid had, he was treated one way. But Tyrone and Lakeisha and Jameer at Pratt Arnold, they don't have limos, they don't have mental health experts, they don't have any of that stuff. So we can see how this whole school to prison pipeline thing works. And I'm going to get into the essence of my presentation in just a second, but even apart from elementary school or middle school, that school to prison pipeline doesn't end there. It goes to high school. It goes to college. It goes to law school. Here's the example. I was lucky to go to Cheyney. Cheyney's the oldest Black institution of higher learning in America. And I'm one of the few people who went to Cheyney University that will concede that Lincoln University is the oldest Black university. It is. Even though it was a Johnny-come-lately that was founded about 17 years after Cheyney, it started out as a school that awarded BAs and BS. So any institution that gives you a college degree is a college. Cheyney didn't do that in 1837, but it didn't have to, because Cheyney was a teacher school and you did not need a college degree in order to teach back then. You needed a state certification. And by the way, for the haters at Lincoln University, the exams that they gave in 1837 during slavery, well, Lincoln was during slavery also, 1854 Ashman Institute, but the exams they gave in 1837 at Cheyney were not only, many of them, in Latin, but they were public examinations where you went to an auditorium and you were grilled. You were grilled by professors when your family and friends were sitting in the audience laughing at you if you failed. I don't think Lincoln's exams were public, and I don't think that they were in Latin. That's all I'll say, but we'll keep it moving. But anyway, speaking of the school to prison pipeline, when I went to Ohio State University School of Law after graduating from Cheyney, and I had a work-study job, and my work-study job was campus security. So from around 11 p.m. to 1 a.m., I was patrolling the campus to make sure things weren't going on crazy. If they were, we called the real cops with guns. Well, the main street in Columbus, Ohio, where Ohio State University is High Street. High Street in Columbus is like Broad Street in Philadelphia. So I'm doing security and High Street's like right across the street, so I can see everything that's going on. And I see a group of about 10 to 12 white guys walking down High Street, drunk, flipping over cars, just getting on the sidewalk, putting their hands under the bottom, 20 of them, 15, 20, and flipping over the cars. And finally, the cops came and just told the guys to leave, to get the hell out of here. Well, when I was at Cheyney, we had the state police who would come on campus. And if you were caught smoking a joint, you'd get arrested and you get prosecuted. So you got the Black kids at Cheyney smoking weed like kids do at every college, getting a criminal record. And you got the white kids in law school, in graduate school, I don't know if they were law school students, I'm not going to say that, but they were certainly Ohio State University undergraduate students flipping over cars and nobody got arrested. So what does that tell you about the whole concept of the school to prison pipeline? It tells you everything. Now let's put it in context, because remember, and I'm watching the clock closely because I want to stop this at about 1:45, 1:50 in case folks have questions or comments. So anytime I talk about, and the topic here today obviously is 13th Amendment to convict leasing pipeline to school to prison pipeline. So when we talk about the 13th Amendment, we're obviously talking about slavery. And I learned from a great professor and author and attorney by the name of Ed Robinson. Dr. Ed Robinson, many people don't know, went to law school. And Dr. Ed Robinson said to me, he said, Mike, this is when I was doing all the attack stuff. And when I was introduced, it was mentioned I'm a part of ATTAC, ATAC, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition. And I'm going to talk more about that later. But that was an activist group that forced the federal government to tell the real story about George Washington enslaving our ancestors right here in Philadelphia at America's first White House. I'll talk about that later. As a member of ATTAC, I was one of the activists, and we had a whole bunch of other activists, and we were angry Black men and women. We, many of us, but not all of us, were college graduates, but we weren't historians. So we relied on people like Dr. Shirley Parham from Cheyney University, and certainly Dr. Ed Robinson. And Dr. Ed Robinson said, Mike, it's great that you and ATTAC are doing this stuff about slavery, but every time you talk about slavery, always put it in context. Dr. Ed Robinson said, Black people are the only people on the planet who highlight their defeat as opposed to their victory. The only people on the planet that highlight their worst defeat as opposed to their major victory. And what he meant is this, he said, Mike, if you looked at the clock of human existence, the first human being on this planet, Homo sapien, walked upright, was 200,000 years ago in the Nile Valley region of East Africa. 200,000 years ago, the first human being in the Nile Valley region of East Africa. And out of Black people being on the continent of Africa beginning 200,000 years ago, we have algebra, we have calculus, we have geometry, we have medicine, we have architecture, we have astronomy, we got agriculture, we got monotheism, we even have the pyramids. And you know now some people are claiming that the pyramids were not made by human beings, they were made by Martians. And the reason why they're saying that's because they had to concede that it was the people in Egypt that we accurately call the people of Kemet. And now anytime you look at a map, and you need to correct people when they tell you about Egypt as in the Middle East. Egypt ain't no damn Middle East. Egypt is in North Africa, and North Africa is in Africa. So if the Egyptians built the pyramids, that means Africans built the pyramids. It wasn't no damn Martians. But that's just amazing that history books or historians in America, and I guess in the Western world, would rather give aliens, Martians, credit for such ingenious concept than to give credit to Africans. So I want to, and the reason why Dr. Ed Robinson, Mike, you talk about slavery and you talk about 13th Amendment, always put in context that the clock of human existence is 200,000 years old. And he said, if you look at slavery, which was in America from 1619 to 1865, that's 246 years. That 246 years is about 5 minutes in the 200,000 year clock. So when you talk to little Black boys and you talk to little Black girls, you tell them about the horrors of slavery. And the reason why it's important to talk about slavery is because that explains our plight today. Black people are where they are today because of slavery and its residue. So we have to talk about slavery in that context. But in terms of the world context, let's brag as Africans about being the first. Let's brag about being the first, not only in human existence, but the first on the planet in Africa, creating algebra and calculus and geometry and medicine and architecture and astronomy and agriculture and monotheism. Let's talk about that to little Black boys and little Black girls. And now they feel great about their existence. Like, wow, I guess I can do better in math since we created it. I guess I can do better in science because we created it. If you know your mom and pop are great in something, you feel like you can do it. Your grandmom and grandpa, you can do it. Your great-grandmom, great-grandpa, you can do it. And that's why it's so important for us to put it all in context. So we start, and by the way, I did say the whole notion of slavery is important to talk about because it explains our plight today. Because out of slavery came convict leasing. Well, even before that, out of slavery came sharecropping. Out of sharecropping came convict leasing. Out of convict leasing came Jim Crow. Out of Jim Crow came redlining. Out of redlining came gerrymandering. Out of gerrymandering came the whole notion of Black folks being ghettoized, put in certain neighborhoods, and based on the low tax rate, or I should say the low tax revenue, Black folks in the ghettos get worse schools. White folks in the suburbs get better schools. And so if you have to mention slavery in order to explain the plight of Black people today. And even when I look at my clients, people often say, well, Mike, I hear you talking about slavery and all that kind of stuff. You always talk about racism. But you got to admit, those Black guys aged 15 to 25, they're really committing most of the crime. So yeah, I hear you about the whole racism thing, but your people, your sons, your nephews, your grandsons, they're committing most of the crime. And I said, okay, on a superficial level, that's right. But let's look beyond or beneath what's superficial. Based on what you're saying, these Black guys commit these crimes for one of two reasons. One, they're genetically predisposed to criminality. That's one theory. They're genetically predisposed to criminality. And if that's not the case, the only other option is there are societal reasons. So it's either genetics, they're just bad, they're just thugs, they're just monsters, or there's societal reasons. Let me tell you quickly about, we often see these young Black men, and even those in the Black community, I'm sad to admit, will refer to them as thugs because they committed some violent crime. They call them thugs and monsters. And it reminds me of Frankenstein. People say, what does that have to do with Frankenstein? If you read, many people see the movies, but if you read the book by Mary Shelley, you'll see that the monster was not named Frankenstein. The monster had no name. Well, who was Frankenstein? Frankenstein was the scientist who created the monster. So instead of calling my clients the monsters and the thugs, let's call the monster and thug that which created them. And what created them? The same system that took Michael Cord out of Pratt Arnold and put him in Masterman is the same system that provides no options to Jamal and his father and his mother. It's that very same system. So my clients are not thugs, the system that creates. And like I said, it's one of two reasons why most of my clients are young Black men. Either they're genetically predisposed to criminality or there are societal reasons. And clearly it's not genetics. Obviously it's societal reasons. So I don't want to spend too much time, but I'm going to get more into the whole school to prison pipeline and throw out some stats and facts and figures, but other folks on the panel, other folks who spoke, they are much better equipped to go into that, but I will touch on it. So we started, and again, my topic, from the 13th Amendment to convict leasing pipeline to school to prison pipeline. And that whole convict leasing pipeline, I got it, you'll be shocked when you find out what happened and how we got to where we are. So in regard to that topic, I wanted to start at the beginning with the existence of the first human being on the planet 200,000 years ago. Before any other continent had anybody else, we were doing our thing. That's the beginning. So I want to go from 200,000 years ago and fast forward to the quote unquote beginning of the end for Black people in America and Black people worldwide, the year 1441. What happened in 1441? Well, before that, the Europeans were doing whatever Europeans do in Europe. But for some reason, nobody can figure out why the Portuguese were geniuses when it came to naval science. In other words, they could build bigger and faster ships than anybody. And instead of using that genius for good, they used it for ill. So now you got the Portuguese with these bigger, faster boats, and these bigger, faster boats traveled around the world. And once some of these bigger, faster boats found its way to the West African coast, this is 1441. And prior to that, Black people in Africa doing their thing. I mean, they're fishing, they're hunting, they're building, they're writing, they're just minding their business. If you can imagine, it's almost like us here. Let's call ourselves, I don't know, the Cord family. And we're here, the Cord family, doing our thing on Zoom. And all of a sudden it's 1441. And it's not somebody knocking on the door, somebody bangs on the door. And we're like, who the hell is that? We don't answer. They kick the door in and they tell us they discovered us. We're like, well, we've been here for 14,000 years. What do you mean you discovered us? We discovered you, and now we're going to call you a European name, and we're going to enslave you, and we're going to exploit you. That's pretty much what it is. So let me just back up a little bit. So Prince Henry the Navigator and his crew arrived on the West African coast in 1441, and they called it Cape Bianco. Now, I don't know what's up with Europeans. And I guess I can say white folks, but certainly not the white folks as part of this presentation, certainly not the white folks as part of this, but why Europeans have this thing about naming things. It's like the thing has no existence, the thing has no name until a European finds it and then calls it something. So instead of trying to communicate with those people on the West African coast, the Portuguese called it Cape Bianco. And Cape is basically like a peninsula or a long extension of land. And Bianco is like Blanco, like Blanc, meaning white. So Cape White. Those Black people didn't call that Cape White before 1441. They called it whatever they called it. But Europeans, like the whole thing about Indians here in America, Columbus thought he was in India. So he called the people Indians. Like, who does that? Well, Europeans do that, but not all Europeans. So anyway, 1441, the Portuguese arrive and they find out that there's gold there. That was the beginning of the end. Because it's really funny because the people of color, whether it's in Africa or anywhere else, when they found minerals, it wasn't like something that you killed for. It wasn't something that you lusted for. It wasn't something that you coveted. It was like a stone or a rock. You can use a stone to build a house, you can use gold, so it wasn't a big deal. But when the Europeans saw it, it was a big deal. So that's why I say the beginning and the end was 1441. Let's fast forward to 1492 with Christopher Columbus. We all know their history, so I'm not even going to get into it. First of all, he never arrived in America. The closest he got was what we can call today Haiti. He called that the New World. It was nothing new about it because those brown and red people had been around for 14,000 years. And eventually this land here is called America. Well, the so-called Indians, I guess the best term we can use is something called Ankwe-Honwe. And Ankwe-Honwe is a term that I found out. I volunteered as a instructor in PASEP. That's the Pan-African Studies Community Education Program at Temple. And there was a red brother by the name of John Lemon Spirit Wolf. And I asked him, I said, hey, you know, they call your people in this country Indians. We know that's wrong. They call them Native Americans. That's got to be wrong because they were here before America. He said, what did you call yourself? He said, well, really, we didn't call ourselves anything. He said, first of all, you got to understand, we were not a monolithic group. We had 500 separate nations. Just like an Irish person is not a French person, you know, a Mohawk is not an Onondaga. We were 500 separate nations. And to the extent that we called this land anything, we called it Turtle Island because there were more turtles here than anything. But he said the best term that he would use is Ankwe-Honwe, which is the original people or the real people. I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about that because I really got to get to a whole bunch of other stuff in the next 20 minutes. So we got to 1441 with the Portuguese finding out about Africa and gold. That's the beginning of the end. We fast forward to 1492, Columbus in the so-called New World. And when he got to the so-called New World, there were 8 million red and brown people when he arrived in 1492. When he left 12 years later, after 4 voyages, there were only 100,000 of them left. Let me repeat that. When he arrived in 1492, there were in that entire area 8 million red and brown people. After his 4 voyages, and he finally returned as a criminal to Spain in 1504, there were only 100,000. You talk about a genocide on in mass proportions, 8 million one day, 100,000 next day. And very quickly, while I'm hating on Columbus, let me just explain that, you know, it's not just me hating on him. His shipmate admitted to the king and queen of Spain what he had done. Not only did his shipmate, a man named Miguel Cunio, but Columbus's own son snitched on him. And it wasn't just Columbus' own son, it was a Catholic priest who snitched on him. And the ultimate proof is that Columbus confessed. It's funny that people don't talk about the fact that when Columbus was taken in chains and shackled and put in prison, that it was based on eyewitness accounts, his son's account, and his own confession. But we don't talk about that kind of thing. Let me fast forward because I got a whole bunch that I'm going to fly through right now. So that's 1492. Fast forward to 1617. 1617 was when the Portuguese raids began in earnest. They started their stuff in 1441, but it's just a few incidents, episodes here and there. Finally, in 1617, that's when they sent the massive quote unquote slave ships. I try to avoid using the word slave because our ancestors were not slaves. Slaves were things. People say they took X number of slaves out of Africa. No, they didn't. They took carpenters out of Africa. They took doctors out of Africa. They took scientists out of Africa. They took teachers out of Africa. But the last time I checked, there's about 55 countries in Africa, not one named slave. So no slaves were brought out of Africa. It was just people who sadly didn't have guns. That's what we need to call them. The Black people who didn't have guns were taken to Africa, because if they did, we wouldn't be talking about the stuff we're talking about today. So anyway, the Portuguese raids begin in 1617 in Southern Africa. And that's when the trouble started. As far as America is concerned, again, I'm not going to get into the history because we don't have enough time. I want to get back to the school to prison thing and the whole convict leasing thing. Slavery as we know it began on August 25 in 1619 in the colony of Virginia. And from that, 1619 up until 1865 with the 13th Amendment is when slavery kind of, sort of ended. But it really didn't end, and I'm going to explain how and why it really didn't end. But before that, I want to squeeze in some local history before I get into the whole Virginia thing. When I was introduced, it was mentioned I'm a part of a group called ATTACK. And ATTACK, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, it's a long, convoluted story. Bottom line is this. In 2002, there was a newspaper article here in Philly about how the Liberty Bell Center, then at 5th and Market, was too cramped and congested, so it had to be moved. In that same article, it says it's going to be moved 1 block west to 6th and Market, where there was more space. And then in that same article, like parenthetically, it was mentioned that George Washington might have enslaved people there, but it was parenthetical, no big deal. We did the research, we found out, wow, the father's country enslaved 316 Black men, women, and children. Illegally held 9 of them right here in Philly at 6th and Market at a place called the President's House or the Robert Morris Mansion, or the Executive Mansion, but it was essentially America's first White House in 1790. And George Washington enslaved Black people at that site. There's more I want to share with you about that, but we don't have enough time. So let me just go from that and back up to the whole beginning of slavery, which again was August 25, 1619. And when we talk about slavery in America, that takes us to the whole convict leasing. And then that takes us to the whole school to prison pipeline. There's a big debate, and it shouldn't be a debate, about critical race theory, and that critical race theory should not be taught in the schools. Well, critical race theory was never taught in preschool, never taught in elementary school, never taught in middle school, never taught in high school, never taught in junior high school. It was always a law school concept. It was based on a notion of critical legal studies, and critical legal studies morphed into what we know today, critical race theory. So it's so funny, I've had debates with people about it, but I always make sure we understand the ground rules, that I'm not going to fall for the straw man argument, because critical race theory does not exist in the schools. So don't tell me why we should take it out. We can't take it out because it's never been there. And the whole notion of critical race theory was this. And again, it was initially called critical legal studies back in the 1960s. It basically said this: we can debate whether or not this country is racist, but what we can't debate about is that its fundamental rules are racist. And this country's fundamental rules are its laws. So if you want to say Mayor so-and-so is not racist, or Councilman so-and-so, or President so-and-so, I can debate you on that, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the individuals, we're talking about the foundation. And the foundation begins at the very beginning. This country made itself known, the United States of America, with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. There were 56 white male property owners that signed that document. 41 of those 56 enslaved Black people. So that's the fundamental document that begins the birth of this country. That's your document, America, so you can't tell me that's not racist. 13 of America's first 18 presidents enslaved Black people. 13 of America's first 18 presidents enslaved Black people. The US Constitution in 1789 described people as subhuman in terms of them being 3/5 of a human being. The US Constitution says that if you leave a free state or free if you escape from a slave state or a slave territory to a free state or a free territory, the US Constitution mandates that you be brought back into slavery. That's your Constitution. There's also the continuation of the importation of quote unquote slaves. It gets convoluted, but I don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to get all this stuff in by the time I wrap up at what, 1:55. So the Declaration of Independence, racist. 13 of America's first 18, racist. The US Constitution with the 3/5 clause, the runaway return clause, and the clause that basically said this: hey, this is 1789. We know slavery is bad, and we know we shouldn't be doing it, but we're going to continue it for another 20 years. And by the time, actually another 20 years, and at the end of that, from the date of our Constitution, we're not going to end it in 1808. What we're going to do is this: we're going to stop the importation of human beings. We're not going to, from 1789 to 1808, we're not going to stop slavery. We're simply going to stop importing Africans. Now, this is the weird part. If they stop importing Africans, why didn't the founding fathers just say we're going to end it? Because it's making too much money. So they say it's going to go to from 1789 to 1808. So if they stopped importing us in 1808, why were there more enslaved Africans in America after that than before that? That's where the sickness of America comes in. Instead of importing them, they started breeding them. The strongest, healthiest Black woman, the strongest, healthiest Black man, force them together like cattle and just grow some slaves. That's the sickness of America. That's critical race theory. That's critical legal studies. Then we go to 1857, Dred Scott. Everybody knows about Dred Scott. Essentially said that the Black man has no rights the white man is bound to respect. And by the way, the Dred Scott decision has never been overturned by the US Supreme Court. Never. People say, well, the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment kind of changed it. Well, yeah, that's kind of true, but I didn't say that it's never been affected by Congress. I said the US Supreme Court never overturned it. We all know about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Brown overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So Plessy versus Ferguson said, yeah, separate is equal. That's what Plessy versus Ferguson said. Separate is equal. So you can have a white water fountain and a black one. Well, in 1954, Brown versus Boyd said, no, separate is not equal, because if it's separate, white folks are going to get something better. So now we hereby overturn Plessy. But the Supreme Court, as of 2022, never overturned the Dred Scott decision. And then we get the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment is interesting because people think that it said slavery is hereby abolished. No, it did not say that. It does not. So what it says is that slavery and involuntary servitude are hereby abolished, except following conviction of a crime. 13th Amendment, you might say, well, how did that even happen? Here's the answer. The people who drafted, who had that tricky language, let me read you something I wrote in the Tribune about this. That tricky language in Section 1 of the 13th Amendment is a result of the cowardly compromise of the victorious slavery-opposing patriotic North that allowed the defeated slavery-loving traitorous South to co-author the amendment. So the same people that enslaved my ancestors wrote the 13th Amendment. Check this out. Those people who were co-authors included the former Confederate vice president, included 4 former Confederate generals, included 5 former Confederate colonels, included 6 former Confederate cabinet officers, and included 58 former Confederate Congress members. So they wrote that language. So what did you expect them to do? Let's keep it moving. So how do we get to the slavery and 13th Amendment to convict leasing? Well, here's how we got it. Because of that tricky language that said slavery and involuntary servitude are hereby abolished, except for conviction of crime, now they start to make up crimes. And that's where the black codes come in. Stuff like loitering, stuff like curfew violation, stuff like being near a railroad line. And why was it illegal to be near a railroad line? It was illegal because blacks in the South were jumping on trains and going to the North. So that became illegal. There was even some crazy laws like black folks cannot look out of the same window in a building that white folks look out of. And I can't understand what that's about, except maybe you got to stand next to somebody to look out of the window together. But think about this. Lawyers and legislators wrote all these laws. This wasn't some hillbilly in the backwoods who did this. These were learned white men who wrote this stuff down. There was another one where it says that Black men were not permitted to raise their voices in the presence of white women. So it's really funny. Often when I'm downtown in Center City, you'll just see me yelling for no reason at all. And people have no idea what I'm yelling about, but I'm just nodding to myself and yelling and making some noise, but it's pretty obvious why. So we got these new laws that were created to criminalize Black people. So when I talk about my topic being from the 13th Amendment, which we just explained, to convict leasing, well, once these formerly enslaved Black people violated the curfew laws, violated the vagrancy laws, violated the railroad laws, violated the window laws, violated the loud voice law, now they were charged with a crime. And once they were charged with a crime, they were then sent to a kangaroo courthouse. And once they were sent to a kangaroo courthouse, they were found guilty. And once they were found guilty, they were placed in the county jail. But the county jail said, we got to pay money to feed these people in jail. We got to pay money to house these people in jail. Why don't we lease them? And the same thing that they did back then with the convict leasing. So now the counties are leasing its prisoners to the same people that had enslaved these people, the same cotton plantation, the same coal mine, the same tobacco field. So now it was a financial incentive to charge people with crimes so you can lease them. And that's why today, the idea that we still have private prisons in America today is a crime that is still going on today. You might say, well, how does that have anything to do with the school to prison pipeline? Very simple. One, I started off by telling you about that kid in court who was by himself and made that eloquent argument where he said, and it's just resounding in my head, y'all set me up for failure. That's what he kept saying. And I'm like, how does this kid understand how deep his statement was? Y'all set me up for failure. Y'all put me in this disciplinary school that only inflicts punishment and doesn't educate me. So all I'm going to learn to do is to fight and be tough. And then once I get out, I'm going to be thrown into prison. Speaking of the school to prison pipeline, I know that your experts already talked about these stats, but let me just repeat some of them. Black students are suspended 3 times more than white students. In the public school system, about 51% of the public school system across the country, 51% approximately is white, 16% Black. But when it comes to suspensions, while the whites have only about 30 or 31%, Blacks have 42%. How can you be about 16% of the population, but result in about 42% of multiple suspensions? And Blacks have about 31% of school-related arrests. What is that all about? It's all about the laws. And I'm going to wrap this up in 4 minutes. So if folks have questions or comments or complaints, I'll be happy to hear them. Well, not the complaint part. There's something in the legal system called certification and DFJ. Certification and DFJ. What is that? Well, simply stated, it's a legal way of locking up kids. That's basically what it is, a legal way of locking up kids. Certification is basically you're 14 years old, you're accused of a felony, and you've been in trouble before. Okay, so if those things apply, now the DA's office can certify that 14-year-old as an adult. Think about that. You're 14 years old, you are accused of a felony, and you've been in trouble before. They can certify you. Then there's something called DFJ, direct file juvenile. That means you're at least 15 years old. You're accused of a felony and a weapon like a gun or a knife is involved. So now you're treated like an adult. It starts off in adult court, then your lawyer has to fight to get it sent back to juvenile court. But think about this. I like to think that I'm smart and always was smart. But I cringe when I think about how stupid and irrational and impressionable I was at 14 or 15 years old. I won't say stupid, but I'll say irrational and impressionable and immature. So you're telling me that the same Michael Cord, who quote unquote commits a crime at 35 years old and goes to adult jail, is the same Michael Cord that at age 14 committing that crime goes to jail. Is something wrong with that? It's clearly, we don't let children drive for a reason. We don't let children vote for a reason. We don't let children smoke cigarettes, buy alcohol for a reason. But goddamn it, we're going to lock them up like adults? Is something wrong with this country? And every time I rant and rave like I am right now, I always wrap it up by saying, but let's do something about it. And what do we do about it? I talked about the problem. Now let's get to the solution. Well, the problem is American history. So we must fight back against those who call real American history critical race theory, because it's not. We need to fight to make sure that the schools teach the stuff I just shared. You should know that about Columbus. You should know that about the Portuguese. You should know that about the so-called Indians. You should know that about all the stuff. This shouldn't be the first time that some of you or your children heard this stuff. So we all, in positions of authority, we got to push back on those who say we're not teaching critical race theory. Because what they're saying is that First of all, we don't know what the hell critical race theory is. That's the first thing they're saying. But the second thing they're saying is that what we really mean is we don't want to be embarrassed by what we've done to Black people. As a matter of fact, in Florida, they have a law where teachers can't teach so-called critical race theory. And I got to read you exactly what that law says, because I don't want you to accuse me of hyperbole. This is what the law says, that you can't teach these critical race theory courses about racism because, quote, an individual should not be made to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race. Moreover, an individual, by virtue of his or her race, does not bear responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race. Well, why would you not talk about it? I'm not saying that I'm not saying that anybody alive today, that any Black person alive today was enslaved. I'm not saying that, because there's nobody alive today who was enslaved in America. I'm not saying that there's any white person in America that enslaved anybody. But when I make my argument for reparation, I'm going to wrap it up with this. When I make my argument for reparation, by the way, reparation for me is not about money, because it's no way you can tell me that at the birth of slavery in 1719, that mother on the shores of West Africa said, you can take my children, you can take my offspring, you can rape them, you can sodomize them, you can torture them, you can enslave them, and you can do it for 246 years, or 300 years, or 500. But at the end of that 400 years, you got to give each of us $1,000, or $10,000, or $1 million. You can rape us of everything, just give us all $1 million in 2022. No, she didn't say that, and she couldn't say that. Since we don't, for me, reparations means building a time machine. And I was going to say, turn the tables and do to them what they did to us, but I'm not going to say that, because I don't mean that, because slavery is wrong, period. But I'm saying build a time machine, go back to 1619, let us keep doing our damn thing, mind our own damn business in Africa, and let them keep doing their thing and minding their own business in Europe. And then everybody's happy. Everybody's happy, no harm, no foul. We don't want to enslave you. We just don't want you to bother us. That's all I'm asking for. We can't build a time machine. So what's the next thing we do? Next thing we do is reparations, but not in the form of money, but in trying to level the playing field by looking at young Black kids who commit quote unquote crimes and recognizing that they are the result of Dr. Frankenstein, who created them. And reparations means send all of them to Masterman, put them all in the limo to get mental health treatment, build museums, build hospitals, build trade centers. I'm saying, for me, reparations is putting Black folks on a level playing field. That's all I'm saying. It's almost like a race. When I say a race, what I mean is this. I'm not asking for equality, I'm asking for equity. And I'm going to wrap this up in 2 minutes. So what I mean by that is this. Equality means you take the white runner and you take the Black runner and you put them both at the starting line, you fire the gun and let them go. That's equality. Equality ignores what happened in the past. Equality ignores the fact that that white guy is on steroids and has eaten the best food and worked on the best machine, while for 246 years, he shackled the other guy. So now if we talk about making things right, you can't put them both at the starting line because one guy cheated to the detriment of the other guy or woman or person. So for me, it's not about equality, it's about equity. Equality ignores the past. Equity incorporates the past. And that's what it's all about. And here's the final thing I want to say in terms of reparations. I use this in debates and I tell the story, fictitious, but it sounds good, where I'm walking down the street. It's, let's say, 2020, and I'm near Broad and Chestnut. That's I'm walking down Broad and Chestnut and see a white guy. And the white guy has on this really nice watch. And I say, hey, so that's a really nice watch. Can I take a look at it? He says, yes. Takes his watch off, lets me look at it. And I turn to him, and I'm like, this is a beautiful watch. And I say, wow, on the back it says engraved. It's engraved, property of Michael Kord I, 1793. And I say to the guy, Michael Kord I, 1793, where'd you get this watch from? He tells me that he got it from his great-great-grandfather's great-great-grandfather. I tell him that My great-great-grandfather's great-great-grandfather was Michael Kort I, and he had a watch. And these white guys attacked him and lynched him. I'm not saying you stole the watch, sir. I'm not saying the watch was mine. I'm just saying you got to give it up. You can't continue to keep it. And that's white privilege. And for me, I'll wrap it up by saying we got to call for reparations in the form of ending the school to prison pipeline. I've gone over my time, but again, I want to thank you all for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely electric. And I just wanted to touch real quick on what you said. And when I was listening to you, the thing I thought about was labeling. And you talked about why did they name things? Because I'm going to be cognizant of where I'm at. There's power in naming things. There's dominion in naming things. Whenever you name something, it shows that you have ownership, rights, and creative purposes over that thing. However, whenever you take the right to name over something that was already named, you're doing something that's not supposed to be done. And so I like that fact that you brought that out. And at the same time, I want you to talk real quick about the media presence of African-American men and women being shown in the news that have bad pictures. We've seen that African-Americans are shown more in the news showing crimes. I just wanted you to talk about that real quick and how we kind of address that issue.
I'll give you the 30-second answer. And for me, it's two things. One, there's the problem of showing and exposing and oversaturating Black criminality. Because yeah, Black people do commit crimes, but so do white people and yellow people and brown people. So let's make sure we are proportional in the presentation. The other thing that I have a problem with in terms of the media, that's both media and social media, is what I call Black murder porn or Black brutality porn. I can't watch another cop killing a Black person. I just can't, because it does nothing for me. I want to know about it, I'll read about it, but I can't watch the life choked out of a Black person. So the answer in 30 seconds to the great question you posed, that we have to do what folks used to do 20, 30 years ago. We got to write letters to the editor. I mean, because I'd like to say just storm the Bastille and take over the printing presses, but we can't do that. So the next best thing is we just got to make our voice known. We got to yell at Facebook. We got to yell at Twitter. We got to yell at Instagram. We got to yell at the Daily News, the New York Times. We just have to individually write letters, raise our voice, and also join organizations that are doing stuff like that. If the NAACP is doing it, become a member. If the ACLU is doing it, become a member. Do it individually and as part of a group. Just because you can't do everything doesn't mean you can't do anything.
I just wanted to jump in for a second and just briefly provide some comments and just say, man, inspiring on multiple levels, Brother Michael. You look great, brother. It's good to see you. Wanted to also share with you that you're probably going to get some phone calls from two of our elders, Dr. Walter Palmer and Dr. Anthony Montero, who are beating me up because they didn't know about this talk today. Though, you know, given the proximity of their age, they were sent the flyer. One question that I did have is, with the context of what we see happening in Philadelphia, where from Arlene Ackerman, nothing against her, may she rest in peace, what we saw with the past 10 years with Superintendent Height and now the new superintendent, how can we speak to getting our leaders, and that's just, you know, using the term lightly, because, you know, Montero talks about the Black Men's Leadership class, and we don't have enough time to go into that. But how can we get our those who are decision makers in the city of Philadelphia to see the homegrown talent as it relates to the system of educational apartheid in the city of Philadelphia, to really tap someone who's come through the system of public education in the city of Philadelphia, instead of this concept of thinking we need to go outside and grab someone who doesn't know the catchment area, doesn't know the multiple ways that Black and brown young people and just young people in general in the city of Philadelphia learn. What do you see as one of the things that we can do moving forward as a larger community concerned about the educational future of students here in the city of Philadelphia?
Great question, and the answer, I'll give it to you in 30 seconds once again. We got to make more noise. I started out by talking that I'm the angriest Black man in America. We all should be angry, whether we're black, white, brown, whatever. And from that anger, you do something. I got to tell you, you mentioned Ackerman, you mentioned Haidt, and I know there are a lot of black, if you want to call them leaders or misleaders, but when you look at the plight of students, especially black and brown students in Philadelphia, you can't be a black administrator and not be livid about the plight of black students. Those are your children. Those are your grandchildren, nieces and nephews. So they ought to do something. And if they don't, that's where politics comes in. Brother Malcolm talked about the ballot or the bullet. I'm not advocating the bullet. And if I were, I wouldn't do it publicly. So let me advocate the ballot. And the ballot means to get your elected officials to do the right thing. So reach out to the school district, reach out to the superintendent, but also reach out to city council to speak on your behalf. They're your representatives. Reach out to your state senator or state rep. So my answer in short is we gotta pressure black elected officials, brown elected officials, and other elected and appointed officials to do the right thing. So we got to be angry, and out of that anger, we engage in progressive and productive activism.
Thank you so much, Attorney Cord.
And by the way, I
Yes,
want to
sir.
say this to you, the executive director, the fact that you said I look good today, so you're probably talking about my shirt and tie, coming from you, that's a major, major compliment. So I'm so impressed, I'm going to wear it again tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney Cord, for being with us today. You had a very powerful, thought-provoking presentation, and I really appreciate your consistent and objective reasoning. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you all for having me. A great two-day event. Please let me know when the next one is. I'll be there. But thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Up next, please help me welcome Zulay Rojas, who will be introducing our next speaker.
Thank you, Gregory. Dr. Benjamin Williams is a visionary leader that uses innovative approaches to developing K-12 environments that prioritize whole child development. He has spent the last 19 years serving in the role as educator. He was one of 4 recipients of the Rubenstein Leadership Award for outstanding performance as an associate principal in DC Public Schools, where he is currently serving as the assistant principal at Benjamin Banneker Academic High School. His approach has led to the development of district-wide laws and policies that mandate the utilization of restorative practices prior to suspension. He's grounded in creating restorative school cultures that help students develop and improve executive functioning skills, which prepares them to be productive citizens. He believes that at the heart of change is relationship building, cultural competency, for example, economic, trauma, religion, etc. The belief in an equitable school experience for all students, and love for the work, love for the students, and love for the community that we serve. Please give a round of applause and a warm welcome to Dr. Benjamin Williams.
I don't use Zoom that often. We're on a Microsoft Teams here in the district, so my apologies. I am going to probably stumble through some of the buttons here. First and foremost, thank you for that wonderful introduction. This is a hard position to be in because the Attorney Cord before me really had some really passionate things to say. His energy was on 1,000, so I feel like I have to go to 1,001. And I'm still at school, so I've learned my background, but you might hear children coming in and out of my office within the next hour. If you do, don't mind it. That's the work that we do. But I wanted to make sure that I was able and present for this opportunity because I truly believe in what the theme of this is, right? Like restoration. And how do we ensure that students who make age-appropriate decisions or children who make age-appropriate decisions are not immediately criminalized, but taught how to restore the harm that they might have caused to themselves, their families, other individuals, and especially their communities. And so that's the approach that you're going to get from me today. It really is a pleasure whenever I have these opportunities to speak because this is the work that I do every day. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Please let me know if you all can see it. Again, I'm not accustomed to using this.
We can see it.
All right, great, awesome. So now. So today, we're really gonna focus on, I was asked by Ms. Rojas to really take it from a school leader's perspective, right? Like the work that we're doing on the ground level. And I think today what I'm gonna talk about applies to Pennsylvania and to Philadelphia especially. I'm in Washington, DC. And so what we're doing is probably very similar to what other inner city schools are trying to do because they're facing similar situations, especially with some of the gentrification that's happening in our communities now, the economic gentrification, not just the racial gentrification that's happening in our city. So you're starting to see some real frictions that are occurring. And so policies have had to change, especially with a new generation of young people as they're coming into the schools with some of the trauma that they've experienced over their lifetime, right? So today I'm only gonna ask you a few things, right? I just want you to be present for yourself, be respectful of your colleagues and their respective experiences, respect your colleagues' bravery, right? Some of you are gonna be vulnerable today, so please respect that as well. Be open to new ideas. Trust the process itself, right? I'm gonna try to take you through a process that's similar to what I would do with our staff at the beginning of the year. Please use the chat for any questions or comments. I asked Ms. Rojas, please jot those questions down because I'm one of those individuals who like to stay until I answer everybody's question. Also, be transparent and honest with yourself, right? Because as we go through this process, you may be triggered by something that I say, something that I've asked you to do, or even during the time that you're reflecting. All right, be honest with yourself because again, that's how you start to make the change that's necessary in order to really approach restorative justice, restorative practices in the most sincere and authentic way. My hopes are, I want you all to leave here becoming bold creators and believers in all of our young people, wanting to consider addressing behaviors and not emotions. And what I mean by that, we can be easily triggered by the behavior of somebody and we respond in emotion. And that's the idea about restorative justice. We're responding to behavior and not only the feeling that the behavior caused. I want you to continue to work on what you've already heard, right? Like some of the work that you're already doing where you're addressing some of your individual biases, right? About race, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic backgrounds as well. I want you to hopefully leave here learning something more about what restorative practices look like at the ground level, at the school level, right? I see that many of you are in the field of law, professors, you all at the Human Relations Commission. I'm still learning a little bit more about what you all do as a whole, but I think all of us impact children in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And so we have to make sure that we're continuing learning and building on the practices that we've already developed. And also want you to see how suspension and the brother before me already stated it very clearly, right? Suspension impacts young people of color by 3 times that of the majority population. And you're about to hopefully see that suspension is a major indicator for students who are going to end up in jail. It is truly a school to prison pipeline. And at the end of the day, I hope that I influence you or motivate you to want to create policies and procedures that focus on restoration instead of punitive responses, because most of our young people who are making mistakes because they have not been taught what to do better, right? They have not been given the opportunity to grow and learn from their individual mistakes. So why me? Why, you know, why do I stand in front of you today being able to have these conversations? And why should you entertain anything that I have to say? So you were introduced to me by Ms. Rojas. You see my academic background. But if I ask people to be to be vulnerable, I'm gonna take this time to be vulnerable myself. So I have a lived experience that I think, and I know it's the reason why I do the work today. I'm the son of a prostitute. My mother was a prostitute in Las Vegas, Nevada. She was a heroin addict when I was born. She had 4 children by the age of 20 years old. And at that time, she then became a crack addict. My mom left me when I was 4 years old. And she left me, and the last day that she left, the day that she left in October of 1984, I remember her leaving and then turning to me and telling me, "I charge you to take care of your brother." We immediately were found in a hotel room after 3 days because I got locked out, and I remember it as clear as day because I was searching for food. We were eating food out of the trash can right at the motel's base. We ended up going into foster care in Las Vegas, Nevada, which at the time and still today is one of the worst social welfare systems in the nation. Bounced around to 13 different elementary schools. And during that time in foster care, I was abused multiple times, physically, emotionally, sexually. And all of it in order to protect my brother, who at the time was what people would call retarded, right? But what they didn't know is that he had lived all of this trauma with me as an infant, and it was just having a negative impact on his emotional growth, his brain growth, as well as just he as a young person, because there was never a time for him to go to therapy to address some of our some of our struggles. Eventually, we were adopted when I was 12 years old, but that did not end a lot of our struggles. My brother got taller, got bigger, but got worse in his behaviors. And his school experience was very different than my school experience. Because of my complexion compared to his, people treated us a little bit differently. Because of my academic ability versus his, people definitely treated us differently. My brother was classified as special education immediately without giving a chance to show what some type of intervention would do in order to help him be able to be part of the general education population. So as I continued to grow one way, my brother eventually was going another. At the age of 14, my adopted father, who is somebody I still look up to this day and I appreciate, he upped and moved us from Seattle, Washington, where he lived and where he adopted us, to Washington, D.C. in 1994. And so for any of you who are old enough to live during that time, you know that Washington, D.C. in the late 80s to mid 90s was a rough area. And me being a kid that grew up in the streets of Bloods and Crips, it was a very difficult transition when I knew nobody in the area. And so my brother then was admitted to a home. His behavior had gotten to the point where it was uncontrollable. I ended up moving with my aunt and my father's sister in Virginia, where I started to continued to excel academically, eventually earning an opportunity to go to the University of Virginia. At the age of 20, my charge ended abruptly. My brother was killed. And it was one of those things that almost derailed me as a person, because it was my child. And it was the last thing that I had as far as blood relationship. And I suppressed my anger. I was taught to suppress my anger. I was taught to suppress my emotions. And in that moment, I became extremely explosive. And my response was, I'm gonna find and kill the person that did this to my brother. Now, mind you, I'm at one of the top public colleges in America at the time, and I was a year and a half away from graduating. But the only thing that I can think is that I lost my brother. And a moment in faith that I found to be the turning point in my life is that God gave me the opportunity to know that my brother was okay and that he was going to be looking down on me. And he challenged, and it was a moment of challenge where use what you learn through this process with your brother to impact and create change for others, which then drove me into education. So that's a long way of saying that our lived experience is the reason why I became so invested and involved in restorative justice. Because people gave me multiple chances for age-appropriate behaviors in my trauma-filled past. They gave him none. Their immediate response was, he is a troublemaker, he's gonna be a terrible human being, but he's 12 years old whose experiences for his 12 years of life, I challenge any adult to try to go through those things and still come out a positive person on the other side. Yet we've never taught him how to deal with these emotions and these struggles that he's experienced. And so that's my journey. That's my lived experience. That's why I hope what I say today has some type of impact on me, right? And of course, you can see that I eventually moved into education. I was a special education aide. I was a social studies teacher, a dean of students, and an assistant principal. And finally, I was able to live my life's dream, which was to open an all-male public high school in Washington, D.C. in 1996, because I wanted a school that would ensure that people like me and my brother would have a place to succeed. And so, again, as I said, I want you all to be bold reformers after this. I'm going to challenge you all to go out and try to break this school to prison pipeline, right? Because you all are in the space to be able to do these things that I cannot, right? We are on the front line, but you all are the policymakers. You all have the opportunity to be at tables that most people wish they can be at. Okay. So why? This was already mentioned to you all, and I feel like this conference for the past 2 days has been focusing on this, but we are at a space right now in our country where disproportionately people of color are experiencing the judicial system for minor issues, right? For example, the major problem with the school to prison pipeline is that we're not addressing the ills and the struggles of our young people at the K-12 level. When you go into schools, you see such extensive gaps between the educational level for our young people of color versus those of the majority and other minority populations. As you can see on the screen, the average reading level for an African-American student is 266. 265 is basic or below average. Proficient is 302. So you can see nationwide, there's a huge gap. Between 1980 and 2015, the number of people incarcerated in America increased significantly from 500,000 to over 2 million. We make up 21% of the world's prisoners. And of that, African Americans constitute 2.3 or 34% of the total 6.8 million corrections population. And as you can see, this is one of those powerful statistics. We would decline jail population if we were treated the same by almost 40%. 32% of children who are arrested or are detained and 52% of children whose cases are judicially waived are African American young men. 3.5 times more likely to be arrested than high school graduates if you're a dropout. 20% of inmates demonstrate a level of basic literacy, and the average offender reads at an 8th grade level. And this is where restorative justice really comes in. Since Columbine, most school systems have moved to a zero policy push out. Zero tolerance for any behavior that might negatively impact somebody else. And these are tier 1 behaviors up to tier 5 behaviors. So disrespect in the classroom, continued disrespect as they will call it. They would then use this to push students out of school, which then leads to those, as stated previously, those students dropping out and then becoming part of the penal system. And this statistic really bothers me more than anything. California spent $62,000 on each inmate, almost 7 times the $9,200 that it would spend for each K-12 student. This ratio is not uncommon throughout the United States. And 6% of all Black men are in a local jail, state penitentiary, or federal penitentiary. I hope those statistics are sinking in just a bit for why this work that we're talking about these past couple of days, why it's important. So I want to take an opportunity. I had an opportunity to do a TED Talk, right? And so during this TED Talk, I had the opportunity to speak on my why. And I want to take this time to play it for you all because it really addresses my why for opening the school that we did in Washington, D.C., which we call Ron Brown College Preparatory High School. And so, Ms. Rojas, I want to try to make sure that the sound works. I haven't done this on Zoom before, so please let me know if you can hear it.
I love it.
Okay, so that's not working. Let me, my apologies, everybody.
That's okay.
You may need to send it to someone because your settings may not have it enabled. I've run into a similar problem. So if you drop the link in the chat and if anyone fills up to try and queue it, maybe Ian could do it.
Okay, so what I'll do, you all, I'll table that and come back to it at the end. It'll help bring together what I'm speaking about as well. So a takeaway from that for me on that clip, when I have the opportunity to review it, I forget the statistics that really, these statistics that really led me to really think about addressing our school culture differently. And the one that stands out to me is the very end. African-American young men in DC are more likely to be incarcerated than they are to graduate college. And that really drove me to really think about our practices and our work that we're doing different, that has to be done differently in schools, because obviously we have a subgroup of young people who are being forgotten about every day that they walk into a school building, right? Because they're being criminalized and adultized immediately as they turn into middle school students, and then they're being criminalized for age-appropriate behavior. So in order to shift mindsets, we have to really be intentional. We have to put people in a position where they have to be reflective. And we also have to ask people to be willing to try something different. Our school systems have always been set up in a way that if you do X, then the penalty is Y. Very punitive. Very few cultures in our school systems ask students to share why they did something and how they're going to repair the harm that they might have caused somebody else. And that's the restoration process that we focused on at Ron Brown. We did not want our young men of color to leave our doors without understanding the impact that every one of their decisions has on so many different people, not just themselves. And so we focused our entire energy not only of educating our students academically, but we wanted to educate them in ways to operate and make better decisions, learn from those decisions in order to then impact somebody else in a more positive way. So today I also am going to address our implicit biases, right? Because the majority of people who are on here, I know, are people of color. But what I've learned through the 20 years that I've been in education is that people of color are equally as responsible for the cultures that are created in our classroom as the majority population, right? We have to make sure that everybody is looking at it from what are the biases that show up for me every day in this work that I'm doing, and how do I address that when this opportunity comes about? And I have to tell you all, this is really weird. I've not done a presentation on Zoom before. I'm really about energy. I'm assistant principal and a former principal. And so like getting call and response and yes, and what's going well and what's not going well is something that I'm accustomed to. So please forgive me. If you have any questions, please stop me at any point. Ms. Rojas, you can stop me as well. This presentation feels like it could be a little bit dry right now. So if you have something that I can expound upon, please let me know. And so what is bias, right? What are the biases and how do we think and how does the brain work? The reflective systems are the implicit biases, right? Those are the things that we automatically do. That's how we automatically respond when a behavior happens. The reflective system is slow, it's controlled, we're thinking, it's flexible, right? It's explicit bias. So we're thinking through it and thinking through the process in which is how it's going to impact the person that we're responding to. In most schools are more likely to have snap judgment. They're more likely to be implicitly biasly based, right? We're correcting the behavior. We're sending the student to the office. We're deciding whether to call the parent. We're going to grade the student's work. It's X and Y versus thinking, how is this going to impact that young person? What has that young person learned from this decision, right? How are they going to grow from what I'm doing right now? Versus, this is emotionally impacting me, now you need to go.
You're
So-
doing great. And we have the video whenever you're ready. So didn't
Okay,
mean to
great.
interrupt, but you're doing a phenomenal job. And normally these conferences run like this, you know, we give you the respect to just take the floor and we just listen. We're here to listen and take it all in. And then if we have a question, they'll be posed in the end, but do your thing.
I appreciate it. Well, listen, don't just listen, right? Like this isn't college where it's a lecture. This is about you all hearing something and wanting to speak on it more, because what I found is that we learn from each other. We learn from questions. We learn from being curious, right? This work, I'm not an expert in this work. I'm still growing and I'm developing and I'm still learning. I can just tell you from the experiences that I have why this work is super important, right? We have to be vulnerable, and like these vulnerable decision points happen in schools 1,000 times a day, right? 1,000 times a day. And you're more likely to come from a lens of implicit bias versus explicit bias, right? If you haven't done the work to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to buy into this idea that I have to check myself as an adult in the way that I respond to this young person, because this young person is a person who's still developing, who's still growing, who deserves an opportunity to develop from this moment, right? And not too many adults in our schools take this approach. So from your lens, you all need to push on our schools, push on your community members to go into schools and say, how are we growing students, not just instructionally, but as people? How are we developing them? How are we ensuring, again, that their age-appropriate behaviors are addressed from the lens of behavior adjustment versus emotional adjustment? And this is one of the most powerful things that I try to put around the schools that I work in. You have this implicit bias or biases that you walk into the space with, which then lends and tends to lead to disproportionate discipline, right? Let's give an example. Let's keep it real funky. As I told you, I grew up in basically in foster care in many different projects, Bloods and Crips, different areas. I've had some altercations in my life. I've had to prove myself a few times because I moved to so many different neighborhoods. Our kids go through that every day as they're walking to school, having to go through different neighborhoods that might have beef with the neighborhood that I live in when I'm not associated with none of that stuff. And so as you grow older, you start to create this bias towards other individuals, right? So I had to, as a Black man, as a Black male principal, had to make sure that I addressed the fact that, Ben, sometimes you immediately respond because you look at this situation as a 10-year-old kid when you got jumped, right? Those kids in the gym right now who are crowded around, they may not be up to anything but hanging out the same way that you used to hang out. But immediately your spidey senses are up because of your lived experience. Now you take somebody who doesn't go through that process of self-reflection, and you know, Ben is loud in class, well, teacher Rojas is going to be like, why are you so loud? And so that immediately response is going to be because in their experience, loud Black people means something is about to happen. Something is about to go wrong, right? So now I have to address this behavior and I have to control this situation and think immediately, get out. I control that with my bias versus explicitly thinking, how was I impacting this young person? And so I challenge you all to go through that process with your children's school, go through that process with your community schools, ask them what are they doing to help young people and moving adults to shift their mindsets in the way that they address young people in the school.
Dr. Williams, before you move on to your next slide, we do have a question in the chat. Renessa, do you want to read your question out loud?
Sure, absolutely. So my question was, as a principal, how do you assist your teachers in identifying their own implicit biases that may negatively affect their students? And also, how do you identify that implicit bias is affecting how your teachers are treating their students? Is there some type of investigation into the situation when a student is sent to your office for disciplinary issues or concern?
And that's a great question, right? And for us, I had a rule. And the rule was that if you came and worked at our school, you had to be willing to participate in all of our restorative circles. And you had to be willing to be brought into a restorative circle if a child felt that your behavior, your response negatively impacted them, right? That it was based off of a negative behavior by you as an adult. And I had to model and lead that as an adult because I allowed the teachers to bring me into restorative justice circles as well. So if they felt that the way that I responded to them was negative or my action caused harm to the entire community, I had to be willing to be part of those hard conversations as well. And to answer your question more directly, that was a roundabout way, but I wanted to provide the context. Anytime that a young person was sent to my office for behavior, especially something that was on a tier 3, 4, or 5 behavior, we had a restorative circle. That's the first response. And so if I, as social studies teacher Williams, sends Zulay to the office, hey, we have to come and have a restorative circle before you can go back to the office, before you can go back to class, and before we move to more progressive discipline, right? That restorative circle had to happen. And in many cases, we bring the families in on that as well. But what I also charge my teachers, don't send this kid out for tier 2 or tier 1 or tier 2 behaviors just because that kid is annoying you, right? Just because that kid is deciding to be a little bit more talkative or they have their head down. Have you done the work building a relationship with this kid to understand why those things are actually happening? And those then became the foundations of our work. Relationship building and modeling what we expect from our young people. And when you go into too many of our schools, there's a power struggle, right? That modeling doesn't happen. I'm the teacher, you do what I say. If you don't, you get out, right? This model is harder for adults because they then have to own the way that they treat kids. And that's hard for people to actually do. That's hard to give up power. And it then becomes a culture of love because you walk out of that space saying, I'm gonna do this better because now I understand. Now I understand how I triggered you. Now I know why me talking about prison and school, why it triggered you, why you started acting like that, or why you walking through weapons abatement causes you some significant struggle first thing in the morning when it has nothing to do with teacher Williams. It has to do with the fact that I just went to see my dad in prison. The first thing that y'all make me do when I walk into this building is to walk in through weapons abatement, and nobody pulled me aside and gave me a hug. I got to come into this class, and the first thing that you do is you start yelling at me because I'm not doing what you think I'm supposed to be doing, but not even addressing the human fact that I experienced some significant trauma on this weekend. And all I need is for somebody to tell me that it's going to be okay, right? And so that's the work that I think a lot of schools have to really start focusing on is like, how do we get to that point? Because as we're going to talk about a little bit later, that emotional backpack is not as easy to put at the door. Think about you all as adults. How many of you can put that emotional backpack at the door of your work when you walk into the space? Because this thing right here is 24/7, right? You're at home worried about your kid because they did some X, Y, and Z. You're at home, your parent, like I worry about my parent, right? My dad, what's gonna happen? I have more access to him. And that triggers me, which then when I'm in the space, oh, I gotta check that then because You got to be present for the young people. You got to be present at the job. I can't take out that emotion on others. And so that's what we try to teach the kids. That's what we try to teach our young men in that restorative process, is how to build your executive functioning skills to be able to be a good citizen in your community, right? Versus being punitive immediately and you learning nothing, and then you're having to figure it out on your own once you leave our doors, which then leads to, most times, some type of altercation that leads to incarceration.
Thank you.
Any
for
other
that.
questions?
I actually have a follow-up question if you will allow me. Can you expand a little bit more about the restorative circle? Does it include the school counselors, and what kind of benefits have you seen from it as opposed to maybe students who did not have that opportunity? Like when you implemented the restorative circle, how did that change the outcomes of discipline in the school?
Absolutely.
Or better yet, student behavior. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So forgive my language, right? I had a kid, his name is, I'll just say his first name, his name is Rayshawn. Rayshawn spent 40% of his time in 8th grade out of school because he was suspended, because he didn't want to come to school, or because he was skipping, right? 40%. Rayshawn said something to us that had me chuckle and still to this day. He said, y'all always trying to restore some shit, right? And that was his response his first year. By the time Rayshawn graduated his 4th year, Rayshawn was pulling young men in as they were coming in and saying, hey, you need to come with me because I need to introduce you to what we call our culture and responsive efforts team, which if you know what that's what the acronym is, but if you take it away, it means care, right? Our care team. Why do we have a care team? Because young men had to see themselves working through the process. People that look like them taking off their hypermasculine mask, putting it aside, and showing that young men can work through situations without violence, right? Long story short, we didn't have any repeat physical altercations in our space over the 4 years I was there. Repeat behaviors, very few, right? Because they knew the easy thing is for me to be suspended. The easy thing is just suspend me. I want to go to ISS. The hard part is having to own the behavior and then having to respond to it and repair it. To have to go back and say, I'm sorry. This is what we're going to do going forward. To go in and say, you know what? My brother was killed last week and I don't know how to deal with it. So I'm sitting here struggling. I took it out on you because you were the first person that I saw. So all of the people in our care team were mental health specialists. And then we would add an administrator, excuse me, and anybody else who wanted to participate, actually, right? Who did I have a relationship with in the building? If I have a relationship with Mr. Holtz going to be part of that restorative circle because Mr. Holtz needs to know, okay, this is what happened. I need to hold you accountable because you said, Ben, that you are going to make sure that this situation doesn't happen again by going to see the school psychologist once a week to make sure that you're working through your feelings. So now I, as one of your mentors in the space, I'm gonna bring you in a little closer and be like, all right, did you do this week? No, you didn't. So you know you need to go make that move. And so it was an open space. Was it perfect? No, it wasn't, right? But we worked through it together and our young people really learned how to be better young people, how to enjoy age-appropriate opportunities and to learn from the age-appropriate mistakes, right? And so, and to add to that story, man, I love this part, right? Like we even had families requesting restorative circles for incidences that were happening at home because their kid came to them and said, hey, Mom, we need to go to this restorative circle at school. We need to have a restorative circle. Hey, Dad, we got to have a restorative circle. Hey, Dr. Williams, Dr. Curtis, hey, we got to have a circle before I can come back to school tomorrow because my dad been tripping. I need to have this circle. And they built better relationships at home just because that communication wall was broken down and they started to understand each other. So hope that long-winded way of saying, yeah, we had multiple people that were part of that circle. So
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams.
Yeah,
Not a problem.
I really appreciate your realism. I appreciate how you're implementing love, because love is coupled with discipline, but love has respect. So I really appreciate that. We have another question from Asia Hightires.
Hey, actually, he's already tapped on it a little bit, and if you want to expand, you can, but if not, you really touched on my follow-up to Vanessa's question. I was interested in how parents are included in the restorative circle, and I wanted to just throw that out there because in Philly schools, we had a presentation yesterday from Dr. Yinks, who highlighted how parents were isolated from the processes that she observed, the way school was dealing with the youth. So I wanted to know how parents were included. You gave us an example. You said it was helpful with them communicating at home. So I guess I'll ask you, do you find more when you include the parents that the parents themselves need a lot more care as well than the child? If you could talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. Great question. Thank you for that. So long story short, long answer short, yes. We have a lot of families and we know in our community that mental health, wellness wasn't always taken very seriously, right? And then we're talking about young men who weren't accustomed to talking about their feelings and going through that process. So oftentimes you would pull a Band-Aid over a gaping wound that families just try to continue to put Band-Aids over. And so that trauma that the kid was experiencing is actually something that the parents were going through and that young man was observing, and they were internalizing. And so you oftentimes found parents coming in, and this happens fairly frequently, parents coming in explaining that they needed some resources, that they needed some assistance. And so what we decided to do was to create a parent academy. I teamed with the school psychology department at Howard University, and we really built a partnership where they can take some of the data that they receive from it with the parents. They would hold parent circles. They would hold parent professional development to talk not only about the growth, mind growth and emotional growth of their young man, but to also go through some of the process as parents, some of the things that they were experiencing, like just really allowing the parents to drive what the parent development presentations look like. And so over 3 years, it grew exponentially every year. Parents got excited to actually have a partner to work with that was outside of school, but that was addressing some of the school experiences that they were having with their young person, but also some of the things that they were struggling with internally, which led to more of our parents actually seeking some mental health support. We were trying to team with where there were some online health supports that were free, where those parents can then start working through that. And then the city has a wealth of resources. And so part of our wraparound services is how do we assist the parents? So that's part of being in the school. So my apologies. So our parents were receiving multiple services, and that's where our school social workers came in to assist, our professional school counselors, all the individuals I talked about who are part of our care team. They were charged not only with helping young people, but they were also charged with helping parents, because a healthy parent is going to mean a healthy child, right? So this is whole child development. This isn't just working with our kids when they're in our building. We only have them for 8 to 10 hours. So what are they going back home to? So if we're not working through that as well, then we're always basically hitting our heads up against the wall. So you all are supposed to help do this work to help them navigate it at home as well.
I wanted to step into this space because our hearing examiner, Darlene, has a really, really great question, Dr. Williams, that she may want to step into this space and actually move it up to the chat and put it in the public domain. Darlene?
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And thank you, Ambassador. I was just wondering, with some of the statistics that you gave about the percentage of students that are not on grade level, one of the questions that I was wondering is, did you see improvement in academic performance once you implemented restorative practices? I I did have experience in a school, and it seemed like sometimes students acted a certain way because they were frustrated or embarrassed that they were so far behind.
That's a great question, and I wasn't able to hear you clearly, but I could see your question in the chat. If you all have an opportunity, so our first year when we opened, we allowed NPR to follow us around, and that was the friction, right? How does restorative practices actually improve academic success? We live in a city, well, I live in a city, but I think right now we live in a world of instant gratification, right? Majority of people were looking immediately for some quantitative statistic to measure success after our first year. When you have students who are coming into your space who have already had 9 to 10 years of school experiences, being beaten down, being ostracized, being told no, being told that you never will be, it's hard to really get that student to invest themselves academically. And so when we first came out with this proposition of doing something different as our culture, the immediate ask was, how is this going to change their number, right? We were charging them to be a statistic. What's this going to do for their end of year statistic? And I stood on my soapbox fairly frequently. I said, are we trying to make better young people? Or are we just trying to improve an end of year number so we can say that we are the fastest growing district in the nation? Well, let me give you a real statistic. 48% of young men of color in our city are graduating on time. In 5 years, 55% of them are graduating, which means we're losing 45% of our students. So you want me to get them to be great citizens when they leave? Or do you want me to make sure that on their end of year geometry assessment, they can score at a level 3, level 4, or level 5, right? And so to answer your question, Ms. Darlene, no, we didn't see an immediate impact, right? But we saw an investment back into school for our young people. It took a year, it took 2 years, but I can tell you by the time the students came in, when they came in with us in that first year, by the time they got to their 11th grade year, we had kids talking about going to college who were often saying, I'm gonna drop out by the time I'm in 10th grade, or I'm not even gonna make it to 18, right? Now we got kids saying, Dr. Williams, how do I get to the University of Virginia? Like, what do I do? What do I have to do to get to an HBCU? Because that's my next step. So that year-to-year data didn't matter to me much, as long as I could see the qualitative data that the students were growing, that the students were developing. I had parents coming to me saying, I've never seen my child study before, right? But I can't put that into a quantitative data to give to anybody. But what I can do is after the end of 4 years, I can tell you that our students outperformed, our students graduated at an 82.53% rate. This district as a whole, DC as a whole for young men of color that year, graduated at 68%. So we outperformed the district just for young men of color by 14%, our first graduating class. The majority of our students, a third of our students were special education students. The district graduated special education young men of color that year at 46%. We graduated special ed students in our school at 72%. Of the 82% of students who graduated high school that year, that's just 4 years, not to mention the 5 years. Of that 82%, 75% of those students found their way onto a 4-year HBCU campus. And those are young men who, for the most part, had no aspiration of going to college. So yes, our year-to-year statistics, they didn't look great, but I was willing to defend that because I'm looking at the long game and not just looking at our young people as numbers, because I wanted to develop a crop of young men, help be part of developing a group of young men who are going to go out and make changes in this world, and who are still reaching out to me now 2 years later saying, hey, Doc, for example, I'm an alpha. And one of my kids who just came to this country, his 9th grade year, just pledged out, right? called me to make sure that I was present, make sure that I knew. We got kids that still stay in contact with all our staff members because they felt like it was a family, and they all as a collective group still talk to each other. So that's the statistic I'm more concerned about, because our students are more than the quantitative number that you might see on the end of year assessment report.
Excellent, absolutely excellent. So I'm gonna present you. Did you want the video to play, or do you want to have some more question and answer and want to keep this going?
I'm going to continue to go through the presentation because there's an activity I actually want us to go through. And so if you guys will indulge me, I don't mind going over. Again, this is the work that I love to do and that I love to talk about. So if you guys have more time that you can, give me, I'll be glad to continue to speak. So let me share my screen. This is so much more difficult. All right. So we talked about what restorative practice, well, we didn't talk about it, but restorative practices, as I talked about a little bit, they build healthy relationships between students. They reduce and prevent and improve harmful behavior. They resolve conflict. It addresses and discusses the needs of the entire community and not just that little interaction. And to my favorite part of it, it repairs harm and restores positive relationships. So we're not just sitting on, well, just separate and leave it alone. No, you're trying to develop and you're trying to grow as people, because that's what you have to do in life. Now, this next activity that I'm gonna have us go through can be a little triggering, right? And I'm gonna take myself off of share for a second. I do ask, as was stated at the beginning, I ask you all to be engaged, to be a part, to go through the process. I will bring it all back together at the end. But what I wanted to show you is our why first, right? The statistics of the why. What does that then mean for me as an individual? Like, how do I see that? Now, this next process, I was vulnerable for a reason, allowed, right? I'm now gonna ask you all to be vulnerable with yourselves. So this activity is what I would normally call a crossover activity. All right, the crossover activity, basically, I would have everybody in a circle and I would give a few prompts and we would silently walk into the circle if the prompt applied to me. Well, we're gonna do that silently virtually, and we're gonna try to see how this goes, right? Like, this is my first time trying this, so hopefully it is equally as impactful. But what you can do at this time is I ask, wherever you are, please sit up. Please put your hands on your knees. Please take a deep breath in, hold it, now release it. As I continue to talk, continue to do that, because these prompts may trigger something in you that you've been suppressing for years, right? You may be a little bit vulnerable and you might be afraid that somebody sees that vulnerability, all right? Respect those colleagues, those friends, those individuals who are on this call right now, who are willing to participate in this openly. Now, when I give the prompt, you can either raise your hand in the chat, the raise your hand feature. You can raise your hand physically, or you can just keep a personal tally yourself, all right? Did a parent or other adult in your household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? And or did they act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically harmed? Raise your hand. Document it on a piece of paper. Put your hand down. Did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw things at you and/or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? If so, raise your hand at this time. Jot it on a piece of paper. Please put your hand down. Did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? And/or did anybody in your family didn't look out for you? Your family didn't look out for each of you, feel close to each of you, or support each of you? If so, please raise your hand. Look at those who have their hands raised. Please jot down if you choose not to raise your hand. Please put your hand down. Do you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? And/or were your parents too drunk or high to take care of you or to take you to the doctor if you needed? Please raise your hand at this time and keep them raised. Jot down on a piece of paper. Look at those with their hands raised. Please put your hand down. Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Please raise your hand at this time or jot on a piece of paper. Look at those who have raised their hand. Please put your hand down. Were any of your parents or other caregivers often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at them? Sometimes or often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, and/or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or a knife? If so, please raise your hand or jot on a piece of paper. Look at those who have their hands raised. Please put your hand down. Did you live with anyone who had a problem with drugs or alcohol or who used street drugs? Please raise your hand or jot down on a piece of paper. Look at those with their hands raised. Please put your hand down. Was a household member depressed or mentally ill? Or did a household member attempt suicide at some point while you lived there? If so, please raise your hand. Look at those with their hands raised. Please put your hand down. While you were living at home, did you have an experience of a household member going to prison? Please put your hand up. Please raise your hand, excuse me. Look at those who have their hands raised. Please put your hand down. Growing up, did you or a family member experience unwanted sexual abuse? Please put your hand up. Please raise your hand, excuse me. Look at those who bravely raised their hand. Please put your hand down. Now, please take a moment to recenter yourself through a few deep breaths. Hold that breath, then release it. Now, Dr. Williams, why did you take us through this? Multiple reasons. We talk about the school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline exists because there's a lack of relationships in our school space. It's also because people have lived experiences that cause them to have and internalize their implicit biases, which cause them to react in the school setting. And we also, as adults, as people, have backpacks of trauma that we secretly carry with us every day. Now, you as adults, take a quick 30 seconds to think about how those traumas that you just raised your hand to impact you on a daily basis, and how hard and difficult it is for you actually wade through life with that backpack on. Now imagine being a third grade student an 8-year-old child who had more in their backpack than that? How are they supposed to live life if we don't take the time to build a relationship and take that backpack off and hold it for them for a little while? That's the restorative process. It gets to the foundation of behaviors to help us understand why students respond in the way that they do. Then to give them a chance to learn from that mistake and also to build their executive functioning and those skills that are also part of that executive function. So they then can exceed the expectations that they have themselves, can feel comfortable coming into the school space and growing academically, but also growing as a person. And so that's what we were able to accomplish at Ron Brown. Our young men who so often were put aside, they felt like somebody in the building cared. The building was full of love. And at the end of the day, more than love, it was full of respect. We respected them as young people and treated them as such. And that's our presentation for today. I'm sorry that the TED Talk didn't work, but I'm open to any questions, and please feel free
That's
to
all right.
YouTube it. And hopefully,
Thank
you
you.
hear something that's impactful.
I just wanted to step into space and say that we're going to make the TED Talk readily available. And the planning committee for this 2-day conference will be following up with you more than likely tomorrow, because we want to come down to Washington, D.C. To your school if you will have us. It will be on our financial dime to listen, to learn from your school. There's so many synergies from your presentation. And so I echoed the same words that Zulai just did. You don't have to apologize for anything. I think as those of us who do this work, we need to be vulnerable. We need to be hyper vulnerable. We need to be our authentic selves. And that's just what we've been doing at the PHRC over the past 4 years, knowing that the person who's been a victim of some form of unlawful discrimination is just that. They're a human being. They're not just a number that we investigate. So may God just continue to bless you. I'm inspired to the point where one of our leaders, Vanessa Edwards, reached out and said, yo, ED, are you okay? And I was okay with being vulnerable, okay with taking off my glasses, crying in public. Most of the staff know that that's just typical of who I am. I want to thank you for inspiring me as a human being, as a leader. I fundamentally, foundationally believe that I'm going to be better because I was in this space with you. And so though you're saying, oh, well, the TEDx didn't work, and like Zulai said, we all can reach consensus that this was high energy. And nobody who looks at this will recognize that there was no energy because we're in this virtual space. So once again, the co-chairs will be reaching out to you. We want to come to Washington, D.C. We want to sit at your footsteps, at your feet at this particular school and figure out synergetic ways that we can be in this space to do the things that I believe that we can do. So many visions have come to me while I was listening to your spirit. You spoke from a place of passion, of soul, and of spirit. And so I just want to thank you for what you left for me and left for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and everyone who's in this space. I saw Sister Elaine Curry here and multiple others. I know that there are some questions. Please excuse me, Gregory, for jumping in this space, but I just wanted Dr. Williams to hear from my heart, my spirit, and my soul. And I'm probably now going to stop my video because I'm really seriously going to cry. And I got these fly glasses on and I don't want to mess them up too much.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for the kind words.
Yeah, if there's any questions, please feel free to either put them in chat or jump on and or even if you have a comment for Dr. Williams, just let them know how fantastic this presentation was. And I understand that there's an energy that comes with being in person, but I can tell you from watching the video and watching the chat, that energy is here. So that presentation was more than profound, sir.
Appreciate it.
Yes, Dr. Williams, I have a quick question for you. This is Asia again. My question to you, sir, is given the level of personal experience you shared with us in the beginning, what keeps you from burnout? Because I'm sure, you know, seeing something may not move so fast as you would want to see it for youth in this country. You know, I know that burnout is real. So what keeps you centered to keep doing this work?
So great question. I ended up having to leave the school because I did burn myself out.
See, that's what happened to me with criminal justice. Oh my goodness.
First time in my life, I literally have been able to manage being a full-time employee, going to doing my doctoral program full-time, being an assistant professor at the same time and doing research, able to manage all of that just fine. But there was something about this that was different. And I think what I realized is that, you know, passion sometimes, many times, can get in your way of self-care. And because I was at a space of not wanting these young men deserving somebody to work until they couldn't work anymore because they could not fail at what they were trying to accomplish, I was dedicated to it. And I thought I was called, I know I was called for a reason in that time, in that space. And so I learned very easily, or upon reflection 2 years later, that if I'm not healthy, the people around me aren't going to be healthy as well. And so I have to take my time. I have to make sure that I continue to refill my cup because I'm in the people's business, and I believe you all are too. And you got to be able to pour something. If your cup is empty, you're not pouring anything. And so finding time, an hour a day, taking the time that you have to cut off everything and step away, because it's going to be there when you get back. Regardless if you leave for a day or you leave for 10 days, it's not going anywhere. And so I learned that I have to do better at taking care of my spirit. So in the 4 years, and I can say this without, it's not a brag, in the 4 years that I was at the 5 years that I was working on the school and at the school, I took one vacation and a total of 7 days off outside of weekends. And so it was about the care of others, making sure that everybody else felt like they could pour in and refill and take care of their families and be in good spaces to come back into our space. But you can't leave like that. And so like that was a lesson learned. And I don't know if I truly have learned that lesson yet, but I'm working on it. I am working on it.
Thank you for sharing, but your awareness is going to keep you centered. So as long as you know, take care of yourself.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I'll put my email in the chat.
Just wanted to echo what Edie Lassiter said in one of his interviews for the local news here at Philadelphia. He said it takes a healthy village to raise a healthy child. And you are doing the work in the school that you serve. And so I want to thank you for that, for just having that heart for the youth, because it takes a certain person to give of themselves and really pour into our future and our children. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time, for your energy, and for sharing your time with us in your presentation. Thank you.
I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Yes, once again, thank you, Dr. Williams, for really showing your humanity through your testimony, which was powerful, showing us your passion, and really telling us about your progress. So we really appreciate all that you've done today. As for this time, I'm going to pass it back to our